Rain hammered the ancient stones of Thornwick Cathedral like artillery fire, each drop exploding against marble that had witnessed 3 centuries of noble blood spilled for power. Inside the vast sanctuary, beneath vaulted ceilings that swallowed candlelight whole, Duke Caedric Ashborne stood alone at the altar, abandoned by every ally, every vassal, every trembling lord who'd once kissed his ring and sworn eternal loyalty. The pews stretched empty behind him. The archbishop had fled hours ago. Even the servants vanished like smoke when the royal decree arrived at dawn, branding him traitor, heretic, the monster England's crown finally decided to destroy. But Caedric didn't move. He stood there in the silence, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the stained glass window, depicting Saint Michael crushing the serpent beneath his heel. The irony wasn't lost on him. The kingdom wanted him crushed. Parliament demanded his execution. The Queen herself signed the warrant with what her spies reported was genuine pleasure. They would learn soon enough that serpents didn't crush easily, and some monsters were made, not born, in the ruins of abandoned cathedrals where prayers died unanswered. You're going to want to stay until the end of this one, because what happens when a man loses everything becomes the blueprint for how empires actually fall. Not through armies, through obsession. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what Caedric was before the woman arrived. Before possession became the only language he spoke. Before mercy died its final death in his soul. Let's go back 3 years. The day began unremarkably at Ashbourne Hall, which meant 2 assassination attempts before breakfast. Caedric sipped black coffee in his study, while his master of arms, Dorian Cross, dragged a would-be poisoner across imported Persian rugs that cost more than most nobles' annual income. The assassin, some desperate third son of a bankrupt earl, left a trail of blood that servants would scrub away within the hour. They'd done it dozens of times before. "Tell me how you got through the kitchens," Caedric said without looking up from the military dispatches spread across his mahogany desk. His voice carried the flat tone of someone discussing weather patterns. The assassin spat blood onto the carpet. "Your cook staff hates you as much as everyone else, monster." Dorian drove a knee into the man's spine, hard enough to crack ribs. Caedric raised one hand slightly. "Enough." He finally glanced at his would-be killer, taking in the desperate eyes, the trembling hands, the absolute certainty of impending death. "You're the 3rd one this month. His Majesty's treasury must be running low if they're recruiting amateurs. The king didn't send me." The words came out strangled. "Your own people did. They want you dead. All of them. Every lord, every merchant, every farmer whose land you've seized. You think fear keeps you safe? It's what's going to kill you." Caedric set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Fear doesn't keep me safe. It keeps them predictable. Take him to the Eastern Tower. The public execution's scheduled for noon. Make it educational." Dorian hauled the assassin away. The man's screams echoing through halls lined with portraits of Ashbourne ancestors who'd built their fortune on coal mines, factory towns, and strategic marriages that consolidated half the industrial north under one bloodline. Caedric's grandfather had been called Ruthless. His father earned the title Vicious. But Caedric himself transcended simple adjectives. He transformed fear into governance. The nobility called him the Obsidian Duke because negotiating with him felt like striking stone. No give, no warmth, nothing but the cold certainty that resistance meant destruction. He'd inherited the duchy at 22 after his father's suspicious death, inheriting also a network of enemies who expected the young lord to collapse under pressure. Instead, Caedric spent his first year systematically destroying every house that had plotted against Ashbourne interests. He didn't wage open war. That was crude. He manipulated markets, exposed scandals, foreclosed mortgages, and arranged marriages that turned alliances into submission. By the time Parliament realized what happened, Caedric controlled 17 seats, 4 regional governors, and enough blackmail material to topple the cabinet twice over. The Queen invited him to court exactly once. It was enough to make her regret the invitation permanently. Now, at 28, Duke Caedric Ashborne owned more land than anyone except the crown itself. His factories produced England's steel. His mines dug England's coal. His shipping fleet moved England's goods. And his political machine crushed anyone stupid enough to challenge the Ashbourne monopoly on northern commerce. Men didn't respect him. They feared him, which was infinitely more useful. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His secretary, Marcus Thorne, one of the few people allowed to enter without announcement, stepped inside carrying a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. "From Buckingham," Marcus said quietly, "delivered by armed escort an hour ago." Caedric broke the wax seal and read in silence. His expression never changed, but Marcus had served the Duke long enough to recognize the slight tension in his jaw that meant someone had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "The Crown is recalling all northern trade charters for Crown review," Caedric said finally. "Every contract, every deed, every agreement signed in the last decade. They're preparing a parliamentary inquiry into monopolistic practices and allegations of coerced transactions." Marcus paled. "That's everything. Every business arrangement. If they invalidate even half of those contracts, we lose the North." Caedric set the letter down carefully. "The Queen's advisors think they can dismantle what took 3 generations to build through bureaucratic procedure. They think I'll submit to committee reviews and respectfully await their judgment." "What are you going to do?" Caedric stood, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Ashborne estate. Miles of manicured grounds stretched toward factory towns that blackened the horizon with industrial smoke. Thousands of workers depended on Ashborne wages, hundreds of businesses bound to Ashborne credit, an entire regional economy built on the foundation of one family's absolute control. "I'm going to remind England why challenging House Ashborne is a mistake their grandchildren will study as historical footnote," he said quietly. "Prepare the carriage. We're going to London." "Your Grace," Marcus hesitated, "if you openly defy a royal decree—" "The Crown doesn't want obedience," Caedric interrupted. "They want submission. There's a difference. Obedience implies mutual respect. Submission implies dominance. And I don't submit to anyone. Not Parliament. Not the Cabinet. Not God himself if he demands I surrender what's mine." He turned from the window, and Marcus glimpsed something in the Duke's eyes that made him grateful he'd never crossed this man. Not rage. Rage was emotional. Age. This was calculation refined into weapon form. The absolute certainty of someone who'd never lost because losing was simply not an option his psychology permitted. "Tell Dorian to select 20 of our best men," Caedric continued. "Armed but discreet. We're bringing insurance to these parliamentary discussions. And send word to Lord Harrington, Lady Ashford, and Baron Kellaway. It's time to call in debts." Within 3 hours, Caedric's convoy rolled through Ashbourne's iron gates toward London, black carriages cutting through autumn rain like funeral processions for a government that didn't yet know it was dying. The parliamentary inquiry convened in Westminster's East Committee Room 3 days later, a gilded chamber designed to intimidate anyone summoned before its bench. 24 committee members sat in curved rows, ministers and lords united by shared hatred of the Obsidian Duke and rare crown authorization to destroy him. Lord Chancellor Pembroke presided from the elevated chairman's seat, his face twisted into what he probably imagined was righteous authority. The gallery behind the defendant's table packed with observers eager to witness Caedric's public humiliation. "Duke Ashborne," Pembroke began, his voice dripping false courtesy. "This committee has assembled substantial evidence suggesting your business practices violate every standard of fair commerce, coerced contracts, predatory lending, market manipulation on scales that threaten the kingdom's economic stability. How do you answer these charges?" Caedric sat perfectly still, dressed in black from collar to boots, hands folded on the table before him. He didn't stand, didn't acknowledge the committee's authority with even basic posture. "I don't," he said simply. Confusion rippled through the chamber. Pembroke's face reddened. "You refuse to defend yourself against these allegations?" "No." Caedric's voice remained flat, almost bored. "I refuse to participate in theater disguised as justice. You haven't assembled a committee. You've organized an execution dressed in parliamentary procedure. So let's dispense with pretense. You want Ashborne assets. You want northern control. You want to break my family's power and distribute the pieces among yourselves like vultures fighting over carrion." Multiple ministers erupted in outrage. Pembroke hammered his gavel. "You will show respect to this body." "Respect is earned," Caedric interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "And this body has earned nothing except my contempt. You claim concern for fair commerce, while half this committee accepts bribes from Ashborne competitors. You lecture about economic stability while protecting factory owners who pay starvation wages and work children to death in mills you've never bothered inspecting. You preach morality from positions purchased with old money and older corruption. So no, Lord Chancellor, I will not defend myself to hypocrites." The room exploded into chaos. Ministers shouted over each other. Pembroke hammered his gavel repeatedly. Several committee members demanded Caedric's immediate arrest for contempt. But the Duke simply sat there, unmoved by the storm he'd triggered. When the noise finally subsided, Pembroke leaned forward, trembling with barely controlled rage. "You've sealed your fate, Ashborne. This committee will recommend full asset seizure and criminal prosecution. The Crown will strip your title. Your family name will become synonymous with corruption, and you'll spend whatever remains of your miserable life in—" The chamber doors crashed open. 3 men entered, each carrying document cases. Lord Harrington, elderly but still sharp-eyed. Lady Ashford, whose late husband had been Pembroke's predecessor. Baron Kellaway, who controlled more parliamentary votes than anyone except the Queen herself. They moved to stand behind Caedric's chair. "What is the meaning of this?" Pembroke demanded. Lord Harrington opened his case, removing a thick ledger. "The meaning, Lord Chancellor, is quite simple. This committee's inquiry ends now." He began placing documents on the table, each one striking the surface with deliberate emphasis. "These are receipts documenting payments from your office to known Ashborne business competitors. These are letters proving you coordinated this inquiry with foreign interests, hoping to destabilize England's industrial capacity. And these," he set down a final stack, "are witness testimonies from 14 factory inspectors you personally ordered to falsify safety reports in exchange for kickbacks." Pembroke's face went from red to white. "That's slander. Forged evidence. I'll have you arrested for—" "You'll have no one arrested," Lady Ashford interrupted coldly, "because these documents are currently being delivered to every newspaper in London. By this evening, your corruption will be front-page news. By tomorrow, you'll be answering questions far more uncomfortable than anything you prepared for the Duke." Baron Kellaway smiled without warmth. "We also took the liberty of calculating votes. 14 committee members owe substantial debts to Ashborne-controlled banks. 7 more have family members employed in Ashborne Industries. 9 accepted campaign contributions that would look quite suspicious under scrutiny. Should we continue, or would you prefer to reconvene this inquiry after appropriate reflection?" The room had gone deathly silent. Caedric stood slowly, buttoning his coat with deliberate precision. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said quietly, his voice now carrying absolute command, "let me clarify England's economic reality. You don't regulate Ashborne interests. Ashborne interests allow you to pretend you govern. The coal warming your homes came from my mines. The steel building your railways came from my foundries. The ships moving your goods sail under my flags. You exist because I permit your existence. And if you ever forget that again, I will demonstrate exactly how quickly this kingdom returns to the feudal Dark Ages, without the infrastructure my family spent generations building." He moved toward the door, his 3 allies falling into step behind him. The committee sat frozen, unable to respond, unable to process the complete reversal of power dynamics they'd just witnessed. At the threshold, Caedric paused and looked back. "Lord Chancellor, I'll expect your formal apology delivered to Ashbourne Hall within the week. In writing, public record. You'll also resign from this committee and recommend its immediate dissolution. If I don't receive those documents on schedule, those financial records Lord Harrington mentioned will circulate far beyond London's newspapers. They'll reach foreign investors, Crown auditors, and His Majesty's tax collectors. I trust that's sufficiently clear." Pembroke said nothing, could say nothing. Caedric left Westminster the same way he'd entered, untouchable. The carriage ride back to Ashbourne Hall stretched through evening darkness, rain streaking against windows while London's lights faded into countryside. Dorian sat across from the Duke. Watching him stare at nothing with that expression he'd learned meant Caedric's mind was 3 moves ahead of everyone else. "That was magnificent," Dorian said finally. "Complete victory. They'll be arguing about this for years." "It was necessary," Caedric corrected without inflection. "Not magnificent. Necessary. They tested boundaries. I re-established them. That's not victory. That's maintenance. You don't allow yourself to enjoy anything, do you? Enjoyment is inefficient." Caedric's gaze remained fixed on darkness beyond the window. Satisfaction creates complacency. Complacency creates vulnerability. "I don't have the luxury of celebrating temporary advantages." Dorian had served the Duke for 6 years, fought beside him, buried bodies at his command, watched him outmaneuver opponents with surgical precision. But he'd never seen Caedric express genuine happiness, never witnessed actual pleasure. The man functioned like perfectly designed machinery, calculating, ruthless, effective. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being human in any conventional sense. Your father would be proud, Dorian offered carefully. Something flickered across Caedric's face. Not pride. Something colder. My father was a fool who confused fear with respect. He terrorized our enemies and wondered why alliances crumbled. He built power on intimidation without understanding that sustainable control requires something more complex than brutality. What's the difference between what he did and what you do? I don't confuse violence with strategy. Caedric finally looked at him directly. My father enjoyed destruction, got pleasure from watching men break under pressure. That's weakness. Emotional investment in cruelty means you're not actually in control. The cruelty is controlling you. I don't enjoy what I do to maintain Ashborne power. I simply do what's necessary. There's no emotion in calculation, no satisfaction in inevitable outcomes. That's how you build something that lasts beyond personal sadism. The carriage hit a rough patch, jolting both men. Rain intensified against the roof. Is it worth it? Dorian asked quietly. All this power, all this control. Are you actually happy? Caedric's expression never changed. Happiness is for people with nothing to lose. I'm not that person. Never will be. So I settle for certainty, for absolute control, for the knowledge that when I give an order, it's obeyed not out of loyalty, but because disobedience carries consequences too severe to contemplate. That's not happiness, but it's sustainable. And sustainability matters more than temporary satisfaction. They rode in silence after that, the Duke returning his attention to rain-soaked darkness, while Dorian wondered, not for the first time, what kind of damage creates a man like Caedric Ashborne? What kind of wounds transform a human being into something so brilliantly functional and so profoundly hollow? Ashborne Hall rose from the landscape like a monument to industrial ambition made architectural, all dark stone and severe angles designed by Caedric's grandfather to intimidate visitors before they reached the entrance. Servants moved through gaslit corridors with practiced efficiency, maintaining the Duke's domain with the understanding that mistakes meant immediate dismissal. Caedric entered his private study, dismissed Dorian with a gesture, and moved directly to the liquor cabinet. He poured 2 fingers of scotch older than most of his staff, carried it to the window, and stared at his reflection in rain-streaked glass. The man looking back at him could have been carved from granite for all the warmth in his expression. Sharp features, cold eyes. The kind of face that made mothers pull children closer when he passed. He'd stopped caring about personal appearance years ago beyond maintaining authority through immaculate presentation. His body was a tool. His face was a weapon. Nothing more. Behind him, the study door opened without knock or announcement. Only one person in the entire estate possessed that privilege. Well? His mother's voice cut through the silence like crystal breaking. Did they bend or break? They bent, Caedric replied without turning. Pembroke will resign by week's end. The inquiry dies with his career. The crown loses its leverage. We continue as before. Duchess Eleanor Ashborne moved to stand beside her son, her reflection joining his in the glass. She was 62 but looked a decade younger, maintained through sheer force of will and iron discipline. Where Caedric got his tactical mind from his father, he inherited his mother's absolute refusal to accept defeat. Your father would have killed half that committee, she observed. Made examples, sent messages written in blood. My father died choking on his own paranoia because he never learned the difference between power and terror. Caedric finally looked at her. Terror creates temporary obedience. Power creates permanent structure. I don't need them to fear death. I need them to fear irrelevance. That's far more effective. Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying genuine pride. I worried you inherited too much of his violence, but you took that gift and refined it into something far more dangerous. You fight wars without battles, destroy enemies without bloodshed. Your grandfather would have loved watching you work. Grandfather was a coal merchant who bought his title, Caedric said flatly. Let's not romanticize ambition into legacy. We're not nobility. We're industrialists playing noble because it provides convenient access to power structures. The sooner we stop pretending otherwise, the more honest our dominance becomes. Thunder rolled across the estate, rattling windows. Eleanor studied her son with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. When was the last time you actually felt anything beyond calculation? She asked quietly. Caedric took a long drink. Feeling is liability. Affection creates vulnerability. Love produces weakness. I watched father destroy himself through obsession with appearances, with legacy, with proving something to men whose opinions died with their fortunes. I won't repeat his mistakes. You also won't live, Eleanor countered. Not really. You'll exist, maintain control, expand influence. But you'll never experience what makes existence meaningful beyond endless accumulation. Meaning is philosophical indulgence. Caedric set down his empty glass. I accumulate power because power is the only currency that matters. Everything else? Connection, affection, human warmth. Those are luxuries people with limited ambition convince themselves compensate for mediocrity. I'm not mediocre. I'm extraordinary. And extraordinary people don't have the privilege of ordinary happiness. His mother regarded him with something close to sadness. You're 28 years old, Caedric. You've accomplished more than most men achieve in lifetimes. You've secured our family's position for generations. At what point does the war actually end? It doesn't. His voice carried absolute certainty. Because the moment I stop fighting, someone else begins. That's how power works. There's no retirement, no peaceful conclusion. Just constant vigilance against constant threat. So I'll keep fighting until I physically can't anymore. And then whoever inherits this burden will continue the war. That's the Ashborne legacy. Not happiness. Survival. Eleanor crossed to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. Your father said almost exactly the same thing 2 weeks before he died, she said quietly. And in his final moments, choking on poisoned wine served by someone he trusted, the only thing he expressed was regret. Not for enemies defeated, for experiences never pursued, for human connection sacrificed on power's altar. She left without waiting for response. Caedric stood alone in the study, rain hammering the estate like artillery bombardment, and told himself his mother was wrong. That sentiment was weakness. That human connection was tactical liability. But somewhere deep in the hollow space where normal people kept emotions, something whispered a different truth. That he'd become exactly what his father was. A perfectly functional monster. And monsters didn't get redemption arcs. They got worse. Three weeks later, Parliament formally dissolved the Northern Inquiry amid scandal that toppled Pembroke's entire political network. Caedric accepted the victory without celebration, immediately pivoting to acquire 2 bankrupt shipping companies whose assets complemented existing Ashborne logistics operations. His days blurred into pattern. Morning reports from factory managers, afternoon meetings with bankers and solicitors, evening correspondence organizing the 1,000 moving pieces that sustained industrial empire. He slept 4 hours per night, ate only when necessary, maintained physical conditioning through pure discipline rather than enjoyment. Dorian worried. Marcus worried. Even the household staff whispered concerns about the Duke's machine-like existence. Caedric noticed and ignored them all. Until the letter arrived from Lord Blackwood. It came via private courier sealed with black wax bearing the Blackwood crest, a raven clutching broken chains. Caedric opened it in his study while morning light filtered through windows that servants had spent an hour cleaning to flawless transparency. The letter's contents were brief. Duke Ashborne. I write regarding a matter requiring immediate attention. My daughter, Lady Seraphina Blackwood, is 18 and has been educated in languages, literature, music, and all appropriate feminine accomplishments. She is of suitable age for marriage and would represent a valuable alliance between our houses. However, circumstances have rendered traditional courtship impractical. I propose instead a binding arrangement. Your financial support in exchange for Seraphina's placement within Ashborne household as your ward. Should mutual satisfaction result, formal betrothal could follow. I understand this lacks romantic convention, but our families deal in practical realities rather than sentiment. I trust you appreciate directness. Your consideration is urgently requested. Lord Blackwood. Caedric read it twice, analyzing implications with the same clinical detachment he applied to business contracts. Lord Blackwood controlled significant estates in the Midlands but carried dangerous debts following several failed investments. His daughter represented his final asset with actual value. What made the proposal interesting wasn't the transparent desperation, but the unusual framing. Not marriage directly, but wardship with marriage possibility. The old lord was hedging, creating structure that gave Caedric access without full commitment, presumably hoping proximity would generate attraction his daughter could leverage into actual engagement. It was manipulation. Crude manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless. And Caedric respected that more than false sentiment. He called for Marcus. When his secretary entered, Caedric handed him the letter. "What do you know about Lady Seraphina Blackwood?" Marcus scanned the contents, his expression carefully neutral. "Very little. She's been kept isolated at the Blackwood estate, educated by private tutors, no London season, no social appearances. Her mother died when she was young. Father's reportedly strict. Beyond that," he shrugged. "She's either remarkable enough to hide or too unremarkable to bother hiding. Investigate thoroughly." Caedric returned to the contracts spread across his desk. Background, education, temperament, anything suggesting why Blackwood's playing this game. No daughter gets offered as ward without reason. "You're actually considering this?" Marcus looked surprised. "You've rejected 24 marriage proposals in 3 years. Those were marriages. This is transaction." Caedric signed his name across a loan document with sharp, precise strokes. "I need heirs eventually. Might as well be strategic about it. If the girl's tolerable and the alliance strengthens Midland's control, accepting makes practical sense. If she's intolerable, wardship expires and everyone moves forward. That's remarkably cold even for you." Caedric looked up. "I don't do romance, Marcus. I do efficiency. If you want poetry and flowers, I suggest you find employment with a different duke. I'm offering the girl financial security, social position, and potential title. That's far more valuable than emotional performance. What if she wants actual affection? Then she'll learn disappointment. Same as everyone else in my proximity." He returned his attention to paperwork. "Complete investigation within 48 hours. If nothing disqualifying surfaces, draft acceptance letter. Schedule her arrival for month's end." Marcus left shaking his head, muttering something about humanity Caedric didn't bother acknowledging. The truth was simpler than his secretary imagined. Caedric didn't avoid marriage from commitment fear or emotional damage. He avoided it because he understood himself too clearly. He was incapable of the vulnerability required for genuine partnership. He could provide wealth, status, security, everything except the warm center that made marriage anything beyond legal contract. But now circumstance and strategy aligned. He needed heirs. Blackwood needed money. The daughter presumably needed rescue from bankrupt estate. Everyone got something. No one pretended it was love. That was honest enough to work. The investigation Marcus conducted revealed interesting details. Lady Seraphina Blackwood was indeed educated, but unconventionally so. Literature that included philosophy, languages beyond decorative French and Italian, mathematics her father's tutors thought inappropriate. She'd been raised largely alone after her mother's death, her father growing increasingly unstable as debts mounted. More intriguing were the whispered stories from former Blackwood servants. The girl apparently possessed what they called spirit, meaning she argued with her father's decisions, questioned authority, generally behaved in ways inappropriate for women in her social position. One dismissed housekeeper reported that Lord Blackwood frequently raged about his daughter's unsuitable pride, her refusal to be properly manageable, her insistence on having opinions about matters beyond her concern. Caedric read these reports with something approaching interest. Most women presented to him came pre-packaged in submission and artificial charm, performing aristocratic femininity with exhausting precision. The prospect of someone naturally resistant to authority held certain appeal. Not romantic appeal, strategic appeal. Because broken things were easier to control than pretending unbroken things. And he suspected Lady Seraphina Blackwood arrived already fractured in exactly the right ways. He drafted his acceptance letter personally. "Lord Blackwood, your proposal is accepted. Lady Seraphina will reside at Ashborne Hall under my guardianship beginning October 1st. I will assume all educational expenses, provide appropriate allowance, and ensure her comfort within reason. In exchange, you will transfer deed to your eastern timberlands and provide detailed accounting of your current debts for potential consolidation under Ashborne banking interests. This arrangement continues for 1 year minimum. Extension or formal betrothal will be determined based on mutual compatibility. Send the girl with minimal household. My staff will provide everything necessary. Duke Ashborne." He sealed it, sent it, and returned to the industrial war he actually cared about. A hostile takeover attempt of Wales-based steel competitors who'd made the terminal mistake of undercutting Ashborne prices. By the time Lady Seraphina Blackwood's scheduled arrival approached, Caedric had nearly forgotten the arrangement entirely, his focus consumed by more immediately important battles. That indifference would prove catastrophic, because he'd miscalculated something crucial. You can control economies, manipulate parliaments, dominate industries, but you can't control obsession once it starts. And obsession was coming to Ashbourne Hall in a carriage scheduled to arrive at precisely 4 p.m. on October 1st. Dressed in whatever proud daughter of bankrupt lords wore when sold as ward to England's most dangerous duke. Apak. The day she arrived, Caedric was neck-deep in contract negotiations with Glasgow manufacturers, barely aware of time until Marcus knocked precisely at 3:30. "The girl's carriage just passed the front gates," his secretary announced. "She'll be here within 15 minutes. Caedric didn't look up from the documents. "Show her to the East Wing guest suite. I'll meet her at dinner." "Your Grace," Marcus hesitated. "She's been traveling 2 days. It might be appropriate to—" "To what?" Caedric's tone went flat. "Greet her personally? Perform welcoming ceremony?" "She's ward, not visiting royalty. Standard protocols apply. Show her the room. Explain household rules. If she needs anything, she can ask staff." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, thought better of it, and withdrew. Caedric continued working, determined not to treat this arrangement as anything except what it was: strategic transaction with living asset. Blackwood got financial relief. Caedric got potential bride with appropriate connections. The girl got rescue from bankrupt estate. Everyone won. He finally left his study at 7, dressed for dinner in black that had become his signature, moving through Ashbourne Hall's corridors with measured precision that made servants scatter from his path. The formal dining room waited, prepared exactly as he specified: minimal decoration, efficient lighting, place settings that emphasized function over luxury. He took his seat at the head of the table and waited. At 7:15, the door opened. Lady Seraphina Blackwood entered, and everything Caedric thought he understood about control shattered like glass hitting stone. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Average height, slender build, dark hair pulled into practical arrangement, simple gray dress that spoke of limited wardrobe and careful maintenance. Nothing remarkable about coloring or features. But her eyes. Her eyes carried something that made Caedric's trained detachment stumble for the first time in memory. Not fear, not submission, not the desperate gratitude he expected from rescued daughter of bankrupt lord. Defiance, pure, undiluted, utterly inappropriate defiance. She stood in the doorway, meeting his gaze directly. No demure lowering, no proper feminine deference, just level assessment that communicated clearly. She was not impressed with his authority, his reputation, or his fucking dining room. "Duke Ashborne," she said finally. Her voice carried unexpected steadiness. "Thank you for your hospitality. I understand I'm here as ward pending potential betrothal. I want to clarify expectations before we proceed further." Caedric blinked. No greeting beyond name, no courtesy titles, no acknowledgement of power dynamic. Just flat statement of arrangement followed by demand for clarification. "Sit," he said finally. She remained standing. "I prefer to have this conversation upright." "That's not a request, and I'm not refusing rudely." She moved to the chair but didn't sit. "I'm simply establishing that I retain agency within this arrangement. You're my guardian, not my owner, and I won't participate in dynamic where obedience is assumed rather than negotiated." Silence stretched between them like blade edge. Every instinct Caedric possessed screamed to crush this insubordination immediately. To demonstrate that authority in Ashbourne Hall was not negotiable, that pride was luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, he heard himself say, "Sit down, please." The word tasted foreign. He couldn't remember the last time he'd added please to command. Seraphina sat. They stared at each other across polished table while servants materialized with food neither of them acknowledged. "Your father sold you to settle debts," Caedric said finally. "You understand that reality?" "My father made arrangement he presented as mutually beneficial," she corrected. "The selling metaphor is yours, not mine. And yes, I understand the financial components. I'm not naive about my situation. But you're angry about it. I'm realistic about it." She took precise sip of water. "Anger is wasted energy. I'm here because alternative was worse. That doesn't mean I surrender dignity as entry price." "Dignity," Caedric repeated slowly. "You think dignity survives desperation?" I think dignity is all that survives desperation. Her eyes never wavered. Strip everything else away. Money, position, choices. And what remains defines whether you're human or simply functioning. I refuse to stop being human for convenience of anyone's comfort. Something inside Caedric's carefully constructed control mechanisms began making noise it had never made before. Not attraction, not respect, something more dangerous. Interest. Genuine, unpredictable, absolutely unwelcome interest. Let me clarify expectations, he said carefully. You reside here under my authority. You follow household rules. You present appropriately when required. You don't create problems. In exchange, you receive education, allowance, protection, and potential marriage that secures your future. That's the arrangement, non-negotiable fundamentals. I agree to those fundamentals, she replied, with clarification. You don't negotiate with me. I absolutely negotiate with you. A small smile touched her lips, because alternative is you dictating terms to someone who nods obediently while planning resistance. That's exhausting for both parties. Wouldn't you prefer honest boundary setting up front? Caedric leaned back slowly. He'd crushed men for less insolence than this girl displayed as casual conversation. But something stopped the automatic response. Maybe curiosity about where this led. Maybe recognition that breaking her immediately wasted interesting variable. Maybe something worse he wasn't ready to acknowledge. State your clarifications, he said flatly. 1. Education continues. Not decorative accomplishments. Real education. Literature, philosophy, mathematics if I want. You have library here, I use it. 2. Privacy remains privacy. You don't enter my rooms without invitation. I don't answer questions about personal matters unless they concern household function. 3. If betrothal occurs, I participate in decision, not consent. I know I don't have that luxury. But input. I won't wake up married because you decided it was convenient. She paused. Those are my terms. Everything else I'll manage. I'm not trying to make your life difficult, Duke Ashborne. I'm trying to preserve enough humanity that whatever this becomes doesn't hollow me out completely. The dining room had gone absolutely silent, servants frozen, Caedric frozen, the entire house seeming to hold breath, waiting for the obsidian duke's response to unprecedented defiance. And Caedric felt something happening inside his chest he hadn't experienced in years. Not warmth, not affection, something far more dangerous. The recognition that he'd miscalculated spectacularly. This girl was an asset to control. She was a variable that couldn't be controlled. And variables like that either destroyed you or became something worse. They became necessity. Fine, he heard himself say. Your terms are acceptable. Seraphina's expression shifted slightly. Surprise? Relief? Impossible to tell. Thank you, she said quietly. They ate in silence after that, neither willing to continue conversation that had already exceeded safety parameters. But Caedric couldn't stop watching her across the table, the way she held fork with careful precision, the way she kept her gaze mostly down but occasionally lifted it to assess surroundings, the way she existed in his space without apology or submission. When dinner concluded, she stood. Duke Ashborne, may I be excused? Yes. She moved toward the door, paused, looked back. One more thing. What? Whatever my father told you about me, that I'm difficult, unsuitable, too proud. He's not wrong, but he's also not right. I'm not those things from defect. I'm those things from survival. If you can accept that, this arrangement might work. If you can't, she shrugged. We'll both discover limits soon enough. Then she left, and Caedric sat alone in dining room that suddenly felt vast and empty in ways that had nothing to do with architecture. He'd spent 28 years building perfect control, perfect discipline, perfect isolation from everything that made people vulnerable. And this girl had walked into his fortress and calmly announced she wouldn't submit. The smart response was ending wardship immediately, sending her back to Blackwood, avoiding complication before it metastasized. But Caedric had built empire on understanding one crucial principle. The most valuable assets were the ones you couldn't predict. The variables that forced adaptation. The challenges that revealed whether your control was genuine or just unopposed. Lady Seraphina Blackwood represented the first genuine challenge to his authority in years. And against every rational instinct, every strategic calculation, every self-protective mechanism he'd spent lifetime building, he wanted to see what happened next. That was the moment obsession began. Not with love or affection or any noble emotion, with the terrible need to understand something that refused to be understood, to control something that couldn't be controlled, to possess something that defied possession. The servants cleared dishes around him while he sat motionless, staring at empty doorway, and somewhere in the darkest parts of his psychology, something ancient and hungry stirred awake for the first time. Something that had been waiting 28 years for appropriate target, something that recognized its match in gray-dressed girl with defiant eyes. And when that thing woke up, in men like Caedric Ashborne, kingdoms burned. But fire always starts small. A spark. A whisper. A single moment of recognition that changes absolutely everything that follows. Tomorrow, she'd attend breakfast. They'd negotiate library access. She'd continue establishing boundaries while he continued pretending those boundaries mattered. And day by day, meal by meal, conversation by conversation, the obsession would grow from spark into inferno that consumed them both. Because the Duke who controlled England's north had finally encountered the one thing he couldn't control. A woman who refused to be controlled. And refused men didn't surrender. They escalated. Morning light cut through Ashbourne Hall like surgical blade, illuminating dust particles that servants would spend hours eliminating from corridors wide enough to drive carriages through. Caedric woke at 5 as always, his body trained to function on minimal sleep through years of disciplined brutality toward his own physical limitations. He dressed in silence, refused breakfast, and was reviewing factory production reports by 6. The girl occupied exactly 0% of his attention. That lasted approximately 40 minutes. At 6:40, his study door opened without knock. Seraphina entered carrying a book from his personal library, something she had absolutely no authorization to access, and dropped into the chair across from his desk like they'd been conducting morning meetings for years. "Good morning," she said flatly. "We need to discuss library boundaries." Caedric looked up slowly. "That library is private collection, not household resource. Then you should lock it." She set the book on his desk. "I found it open at 4 this morning when I couldn't sleep. Spent 2 hours reading Locke's treatises on government, fascinating arguments about consent and social contract. You've made notes in the margins. Some I agree with. Most I find conveniently self-serving. You broke into my private study. I walked through an unlocked door in house where I'm resident." She met his stare without flinching. "If you want spaces to remain private, communicate that clearly. I'm not psychic. And I'm not going to apologize for reading philosophy you apparently also find valuable enough to annotate." Every management instinct Caedric possessed screamed to establish dominance immediately, to make example that would prevent future boundary violations, to demonstrate that his authority wasn't suggestion she could interpret creatively. Instead, he heard himself ask, "What did you disagree with?" "Pardon?" "In the margins. You said you disagreed with most of my notes. Specify." Seraphina leaned back, studying him with that unsettling directness. "You've underlined Locke's passages about natural rights and property ownership. Your notes suggest you view accumulation as natural law, that whoever has capacity to take and hold resources deserves them. That's convenient philosophy for someone who's taken and held considerable resources. It's realistic philosophy. Property rights require enforcement. Enforcement requires power. Therefore, power and property are inseparable. That's not convenience, that's observation. It's justification dressed as observation." She tapped the book. "Locke argues for consent of the governed. You've ignored every passage about legitimate authority requiring agreement from those subject to it. You only mark the sections that rationalize your existing position, because the sections about consent are idealistic fantasy," Caedric said coldly. "Governed don't consent. They comply or resist. Those who comply receive stability. Those who resist receive consequences. The entire social contract theory collapses the moment you introduce actual human behavior instead of philosophical abstractions. So your version of natural law is just whoever's strongest makes the rules? My version of natural law is whoever's most effective makes the rules and everyone else adapts or dies. Nature doesn't care about fairness, only functionality." Seraphina smiled without warmth. "Then we agree. You're not noble. You're just functional predator who's good at rationalizing predation as philosophy." The silence that followed carried weight that made the air itself feel dense. Caedric had been called monster before. Ruthless, vicious, obsidian, every insult designed to wound pride or challenge authority. But no one had ever reduced his entire worldview to predation and called it to his face with such clinical detachment. It should have triggered rage. Instead, it triggered something worse. Respect. Grudging, unwanted, absolutely inconvenient respect for someone who saw through every self-justification he'd constructed and simply stated the truth beneath. "You're either remarkably brave or catastrophically stupid," he said finally. "I'm neither. I'm honest." She stood, leaving the book on his desk. "Lock your library if you want it private. Otherwise, I'll continue reading your collection and disagreeing with your notes. We can argue philosophy at breakfast if you're interested in perspectives beyond your own. Or we can maintain hostile silence and waste time. We're both stuck here anyway." She left before he could respond. And Caedric sat staring at closed door, his carefully planned day completely derailed by 18-year-old girl who just called him functional predator and invited him to breakfast debate like they were academic colleagues instead of guardian and ward, an arrangement built on desperation and transaction. He should end this, send her back, maintain distance. Instead, he found himself at breakfast table 30 minutes later, watching her eat with same precise movements she applied to everything, waiting for her to initiate conversation she'd suggested. She didn't speak for 10 full minutes. Finally, Caedric broke. "You wanted to argue philosophy. I wanted to offer the option." She sipped tea without looking at him. "You're the one who chose to appear. I'm comfortable with silence. Your intentionally provoking response. I'm existing in space we both occupy. Your interpretation of that as provocation says more about your psychology than my intentions." He set down his fork carefully. "You understand that most people in your position would be considerably more deferential? Most people in my position have been taught their survival depends on pleasing powerful men." Her eyes lifted to his. "I was taught that survival depends on maintaining enough self-respect that you don't hollow out completely in the process. Different lessons produce different behaviors. Your father taught you that?" "My father taught me that powerful men view deference as weakness and independence as threat. That there's no winning strategy except choosing which vulnerability you're willing to accept. I chose the one that lets me sleep at night. And if I choose to make that independence too costly to maintain, then I'll learn whether I'm as strong as I think I am." Small smile. "But you won't do that. Why not?" "Because you're bored." She returned attention to her breakfast. "You've spent years building empire where everyone fears you, obeys you, performs predictable responses to your authority. It's effective, but it's tedious. I'm first genuinely unpredictable variable you've encountered in your own house. You won't eliminate that just to prove point you've already proven 1,000 times." The observation struck like physical blow. Not because it was insulting, because it was accurate. Caedric had built perfect system of control so effective it had become prison. Every person in his orbit responded identically. Fear, obedience, resentment performed as respect. He'd won so completely that victory itself became meaningless repetition, and this girl recognized that within 24 hours of arrival. "You're observant," he said quietly. "I'm attentive. There's difference. Observation is passive. Attention is survival skill." She finished her tea. "Are we done with philosophical sparring, or do you want to continue? What would continuing look like? You tell me what you actually want from this arrangement beyond convenient heir production and Midlands alliance. I'll tell you what I'm willing to provide beyond compliance and eventual pregnancy. We negotiate honest terms instead of performing roles neither of us believes." The brutally transactional framing should have been offensive. Instead, it was clarifying in ways Caedric hadn't expected. Most women presented to him performed elaborate pretense that arrangement was about connection rather than contract. They smiled and flirted and pretended not to notice the hollowness beneath transaction. It was exhausting watching people lie to themselves. Seraphina didn't bother. She acknowledged reality and offered negotiation within it. That was honest enough to be dangerous. "I want heirs," Caedric said bluntly. "I want social appearance of functional marriage to satisfy expectations. I want someone who won't create problems that distract from actual priorities. In exchange, I'll provide security, status, resources, and relative autonomy within reasonable boundaries." Define reasonable boundaries. Nothing that damages my reputation or business interests. Nothing that creates vulnerability enemies can exploit. Nothing that requires me to pretend emotional investment I'm incapable of providing. An affection? Partnership? Basic human warmth? Are luxuries I don't offer. His voice went flat. "I'm not cruel. I won't mistreat you. But I won't love you either. That's not how I function. If you need romantic fantasy, you'll have to generate it internally, because I can't supply external version. Seraphina studied him for a long moment. That's the most honest thing you've said since I arrived. It's the most honest thing I say to anyone. Then we can work with it. She stood. I don't need love. I need respect. I don't need warmth. I need space. I don't need partnership. I need acknowledgement that I retain personhood within transaction. You provide those. I'll provide heirs and social performance and no problems. That's cleaner deal than most marriages offer. She left him sitting alone at breakfast table, morning sunlight cutting through windows to illuminate empty chairs she'd vacated. And Caedric realized something that should have been warning sign, but felt more like recognition. He just conducted most honest conversation of his adult life, with girl who'd been in his house less than 24 hours. That was dangerous in ways he didn't have vocabulary to articulate. The pattern established itself over following weeks with organic efficiency that resembled choreography more than conflict. Seraphina claimed corner of his library for morning reading. Caedric worked through correspondence while she annotated books from his collection, occasionally interrupting with observations that forced him to defend positions he'd never questioned. She attended dinners, participated in minimal required social functions, maintained appropriate appearance. In exchange, he granted library access, education budget, and privacy he'd never offered anyone. To outside observers, the arrangement appeared functional. To Caedric, it felt like controlled burn he couldn't quite extinguish. The problem wasn't that she challenged him. He'd crushed challenges before. The problem was how she challenged, with arguments good enough to force actual thought rather than reflexive dismissal, with questions that exposed assumptions he'd treated as facts, with perspective that reminded him his worldview was choice rather than inevitability. It was destabilizing, which made it intolerable, which made it addictive. 3 weeks after her arrival, Dorian cornered him in the armory where Caedric maintained his sword collection, antiques worth small fortunes that he occasionally used for practice because destroying valuable things reminded him that permanence was illusion. The household's talking, Dorian said carefully, about you and Lady Seraphina. Let them talk. Caedric inspected cavalry saber from Napoleonic Wars. Gossip doesn't concern me. They're saying you've softened, that she's changing you. That's absurd. He set the saber down with more force than necessary. Nothing about my management has changed. Factory output remains constant. Business expansion continues on schedule. Parliamentary influence holds steady. One girl's presence doesn't alter strategic priorities. You spent 2 hours arguing about property rights with her yesterday instead of attending the trade meeting. I sent Marcus. The meeting was routine. You never delegate routine meetings. Dorian moved closer. And you're smiling more. Not much. But more. That's unprecedented. Smiling isn't softness, it's social adaptation. You've never socially adapted before. You've crushed social expectations and imposed your own standards. Now you're engaging in philosophical debates and granting library access and asking her opinion about things you'd normally decide unilaterally. That's not adaptation, that's accommodation. And you don't accommodate anyone. Caedric turned on him with sudden intensity. She's temporary variable in permanent system. Her presence doesn't alter foundations. It adds surface complexity that will be integrated or eliminated based on utility. That's not softness. That's efficiency. Keep telling yourself that. Dorian headed for the door, paused. But I've watched you build this empire through absolute control, and I've never seen you tolerate anyone who challenges your authority the way she does. That's either growth or weakness. You need to decide which before it decides for you. He left Caedric alone with sword collection worth more than most estates, surrounded by weapons that had killed men in service of causes long forgotten, and the hollow victory of being right about everything except the thing that mattered. He wasn't softening, he was fracturing, and fractured things either healed stronger or shattered completely. The breaking point arrived during parliamentary session 6 weeks after Seraphina's arrival. Caedric attended quarterly Commons address where ministers reported industrial production, trade balances, labor conditions across England's manufacturing regions. He normally used these sessions to identify weak political positions he could exploit, noting which lords were vulnerable to pressure, which alliances showed strain, which policies created opportunities. This session focused on factory safety regulations. Some progressive ministers wanted to implement mandatory equipment inspections, child labor restrictions, injury compensation requirements, standard reformist agenda that threatened profit margins. Caedric prepared his usual counterarguments. Market forces self-regulate better than government mandates. Additional regulations increase costs that hurt workers through reduced employment. Safety concerns are exaggerated by activists who've never managed actual industrial operations. He'd given these speeches dozens of times. They worked because they contained enough truth mixed with convenient omission to sound reasonable to people who wanted to avoid thinking about the actual human cost of industrial efficiency. But halfway through his prepared remarks, defending the position that market competition naturally incentivized safe working conditions, he heard Seraphina's voice in his head. That's justification dressed as observation. His speech faltered. The Commons chamber went silent, waiting for the Obsidian Duke to continue his characteristically ruthless dismantling of worker protection proposals. Caedric stood at the podium, staring at a sea of faces, many hostile, some sympathetic, all expecting him to perform the role he'd perfected, defender of industrial authority against sentimental reform. And he realized with sudden clarity that every word he'd been about to speak was rationalization. Not because the arguments were technically invalid, because they ignored the reality he'd spent years deliberately not examining, that his factories worked children until exhaustion broke their bodies, that his mines collapsed on workers whose families received no compensation, that his efficiency was built on human cost he'd labeled acceptable because acknowledging it as unacceptable required him to change. The silence stretched. Ministers began murmuring. The speaker looked concerned. Caedric gripped the podium and made decision that violated every strategic instinct he'd cultivated. I withdraw my opposition to the proposed safety regulations, he said clearly. House Ashborne will implement equipment inspections, end child labor under age 12, and establish injury compensation fund. Other industrial houses may follow or face competitive disadvantage of appearing less responsible. The chamber exploded into chaos. Ministers who'd expected opposition looked stunned. Reform advocates appeared confused by sudden ally. Industrial lords began shouting about betrayal, about Ashborne abandoning their collective interests, about precedent this set. Caedric ignored them all and left. The carriage ride back to Ashborne Hall stretched through afternoon light that seemed too bright, too ordinary, for the magnitude of what he'd just destroyed. Every industrial alliance in England now viewed him as traitor. His political machine would spend months repairing damage. Factory owners across the north would see this as weakness to exploit. He'd handed enemies opening they'd been praying for. And he did it because Girl with Defiant Eyes had spent 6 weeks teaching him that rationalizations eventually collapse under their own weight. Marcus met him at the entrance, white-faced. Your Grace, the telegrams are already arriving. Lord Manchester demands explanation. Baron Hargrove says you've destroyed collective bargaining position. 3 factory owners want immediate meetings. The Northern Industrial Alliance is threatening to cancel my schedule, Caedric interrupted. All of it. I'll address the situation tomorrow. Tomorrow? Marcus looked panicked. This needs immediate response. Every industrial interest in England thinks you've lost your mind or been compromised. We need damage control now. What we need is for everyone to understand that Ashborne interests evolve based on strategic reassessment, not external pressure, not moral crisis. Strategic calculation. He moved past his secretary toward the library. Tell them I'll release formal statement tomorrow explaining the business logic. What business logic? You just chose long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. It's a defensible position once properly framed. Now leave me alone. He found Seraphina in her usual corner reading something that looked like economic theory, completely unaware of the political earthquake that had just reshaped England's industrial landscape. She looked up when he entered. You're early. Usually you work until... I destroyed my political coalition this afternoon, he interrupted. Probably cost myself millions in industrial partnerships. Set precedent that will take years to walk back if I want to maintain current influence. Her expression shifted to something like concern. What happened? I listened to your voice in my head telling me my rationalizations were bullshit, and I realized you were right. And I acted on that realization in the worst possible venue at the worst possible time. So now I'm politically exposed, economically vulnerable, and questioning every foundation I've built my entire worldview on. He dropped into a chair across from her. You've been here 6 weeks and you've destroyed everything I spent a decade constructing. That's not fair. She set down her book carefully. I didn't ask you to change. I just challenged your assumptions. What you do with that is your choice. Except, it's not. Caedric leaned forward, and something in his voice made her go still. Because once you see the rationalizations clearly, you can't unsee them. You can't keep believing comfortable lies after someone exposes them as lies. You've systematically dismantled every defensive position I used to justify my methods. And now I'm sitting here questioning whether anything I've built has actual value beyond raw accumulation. The library had gone very quiet. You're saying this is my fault? Her voice stayed level but carried edge. I'm saying you're dangerous, not in ways I planned for. You don't threaten my business or my safety. You threaten my certainty. And certainty is the only thing that's kept me functional for years. Without it, I'm just functional predator with enough self-awareness to recognize the predation, but not enough direction to stop. Then stop, she said simply. Stop what? Being predator. Choose something else. You have resources, intelligence, influence. Use them differently. It's not that simple. Why not? Because changing means admitting every choice I've made until now was wrong. Every person I've hurt, every system I've defended, every rationalization I've used. Changing means acknowledging that the monster everyone calls me isn't circumstance or necessity. It's choice. And I chose it every single day. I chose to be this. The admission hung between them like blades suspended by thread. Seraphina stood, moved to stand beside his chair. You're not monster, she said quietly. You're a man who's convinced himself that being monster is only option. Those aren't the same thing. How would you know? He looked up at her. You've known me 6 weeks. You've seen the performance, not the reality. I've seen you argue philosophy at breakfast. Challenge your own positions mid-conversation. Question assumptions you've held for years. Monsters don't do that. Monsters double down. You're evolving. That's terrifying, but it's not monstrous. Evolving into what? Something better than what you were. She paused. If you let it happen instead of fighting it. And if I can't, if the certainty you've destroyed was the only thing holding me together, and without it, I just fracture. Then you fracture. And you rebuild from better foundation. Her hand touched his shoulder, brief contact that felt like lightning strike. But you don't get to blame me for pointing out cracks that were always there. I just made them visible. She left him alone in the library while sunset bled through windows, painting bookshelves red and gold, and Caedric sat in silence, acknowledging what he'd been fighting since the moment she walked into his house. He'd been looking for variable to control. Instead, he'd found variable that controlled him, not through manipulation or seduction or any traditional feminine strategy, through the simple act of seeing him clearly and refusing to pretend the clarity was anything except devastating. The political fallout consumed the next month. Industrial lords demanded meetings Caedric refused to take. Parliament convened special sessions to address precedent he'd set. Factory owners across England scrambled to either implement similar reforms or explain why Ashbourne's sudden conscience didn't apply to their operations. Through it all, Caedric maintained cold position that his decision was strategic rather than moral, that long-term sustainability required appearing responsible, that worker welfare was brand management rather than ethical obligation. The public bought it. His enemies didn't. They recognized what had actually happened. The Obsidian Duke had blinked, shown weakness, demonstrated that pressure could produce policy change, and pressure, once successful, escalates. The assassination attempt came on a Tuesday. Caedric was reviewing revised factory protocols in his study when Dorian burst through the door, sword drawn, shouting orders to household guards who materialized from corridors like armed shadows. We've got infiltrators, Dorian snapped. At least 3. Professional, they're inside the house. Lock yourself in and don't open for anyone except me. Where's Lady Seraphina? East Wing. I sent guards. She's secure. Caedric moved to the weapons cabinet, pulled out loaded pistol and cavalry saber. I'm not hiding in my own house. Your Grace, this isn't the time for... I said I'm not hiding. He checked the pistol's chamber with practiced efficiency. Either help me or get out of the way. They moved through Ashbourne Hall's corridors with tactical precision Caedric had learned from his father. Back to walls, checking corners, listening for footfalls that didn't match household staff patterns. Somewhere ahead, steel clashed against steel. Servants screamed. The first assassin came around corner near the main staircase, blade already moving toward Caedric's throat with speed that confirmed professional training. Caedric fired without hesitation, the pistol's report deafening in enclosed space. The man dropped. Two more emerged from side passage, moving with coordinated efficiency that spoke of military background. Dorian engaged the first while Caedric faced the second, saber meeting short sword and shower of sparks that lit the dark corridor like lightning. The assassin was good, better than good, trained by someone who understood Ashbourne's defensive patterns and anticipated responses. But Caedric had learned to fight from his father, who'd survived 3 legitimate coups and 2 family insurrections. He didn't fence with elegance. He fought with brutal efficiency designed to end conflicts before opponent adjusted to his style. 3 exchanges. The assassin overextended on a feint. Caedric's saber opened his throat. Dorian dispatched his opponent simultaneously, both men standing over bodies while blood pooled across imported marble that would take days to properly clean. "That's 2, Dorian said, breathing hard. "Third one still—" Scream echoed from the east wing. Female scream. Seraphina. Caedric ran. He reached her quarters to find the door splintered, guards down, and the third assassin holding knife to Seraphina's throat, while she stood absolutely still, eyes locked on Caedric with expression that mixed terror and fury in equal measure. "Drop the weapon," the assassin said. Professional voice, no accent, expensive training, or she dies. Caedric stopped 5 feet away, saber still in hand. "Who sent you? Drop the weapon, or who sent you?" His voice went dead flat, the tone that usually made hardened soldiers reconsider their life choices. The assassin pressed knife closer. Seraphina's breath hitched, but she didn't make sound. Small line of blood appeared where blade touched skin. And something inside Caedric broke. Not fractured, not damaged, shattered completely. All the control he'd spent lifetime building, all the discipline he'd cultivated, all the rational distance between him and violence. Gone. What remained was something older, something his father would have recognized, something that had been sleeping under civilized surface waiting for appropriate trigger. Protective rage so absolute it transcended thought. He moved before conscious decision registered, saber cutting upward in arc that forced the assassin to choose between maintaining hold on Seraphina or blocking strike that would split his skull. The man chose survival, releasing her and deflecting with knife that shattered under cavalry steel's impact. Caedric didn't stop, didn't calculate, didn't think. He drove the assassin backward through doorway, saber work transforming from fencing into pure butchery. The man tried to retreat, tried to surrender, tried to explain who'd hired him. Caedric killed him anyway. The body dropped in the corridor. Silence crashed down like physical weight. Caedric stood over the corpse, saber dripping, breathing like he'd run miles, and slowly became aware of Seraphina in the doorway behind him. She was staring at him with expression he couldn't interpret. Not fear, exactly. Not gratitude. Something more complex. Something that recognized what she'd just witnessed wasn't protection. It was possession manifest as violence. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rough. "No. Small. Quiet." The guards. Dead. Dorian appeared, taking in the scene with professional assessment. All 3 assassins eliminated. "I'll start interrogating household staff. Someone let them in. We'll find out who." "Do that." Caedric finally lowered the saber. "And triple the guard. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization." "Your Grace," Dorian hesitated, "you should sit down." "You're fine. I'm fine. Get the bodies cleared. Investigate the breach. Report when you have answers." Dorian left, taking guards with him, leaving Caedric alone with Seraphina in corridor painted with violence he'd unleashed. "You could have disarmed him," she said finally. "You didn't have to kill him." "No." Caedric cleaned his saber with mechanical precision. "I didn't have to." "Then why?" "Because he touched you, hurt you, put knife to your throat in my house under my protection." The admission came out flat, emotionless. "And I don't forgive that. Can't forgive that. Won't forgive that." He looked at her directly. "I told you I don't love. Can't offer affection or warmth or partnership. I told you I was functional predator choosing predation daily. And I meant all of that. But apparently I'm also possessive in ways I didn't fully understand until someone threatened what I consider mine. I'm not yours." "Yes." Caedric's voice dropped to something barely above whisper. "You are. Not legally yet. Not formally. But functionally, absolutely. In every way that matters psychologically. You're mine. And what's mine doesn't get hurt, doesn't get threatened, doesn't get knife held to throat while I'm breathing. That's not healthy. No, it's really not. He moved past her into her damaged quarters. But it's honest, which you said you valued. So there's your honesty. I'm not good man having moral evolution. I'm obsessive man who's found something to obsess over. An obsession in someone like me looks like absolute violence against anything that threatens the focus. Seraphina stood in the doorway, backlit by corridor gas lamps, and something in her expression shifted. Not fear, not acceptance, something else. I should leave, she said quietly. This arrangement was a mistake. I'm not equipped to handle whatever you're becoming. No, the word came out harder than intended. You don't leave. Can't leave. Won't leave. We're past that point. You don't control... I control everything in this house, including who stays and who goes. He turned to face her fully. You wanted honesty? Here's honesty. You've destroyed my certainty, fractured my control, made me question foundations I spent lifetime building. And somewhere in that destruction, you became necessity. Not want, not preference. Necessity. The thing I can't function without. That's not healthy. That's not safe. That's not anything except truth. So no, you're not leaving, because I won't allow it. The silence stretched between them like abyss. You're actually threatening me. I'm stating reality. Threats imply uncertainty. I'm certain. You stay. We continue. The arrangement evolves into whatever it evolves into, and you accept that or fight it, but either way, the outcome is inevitable. That's insane. That's obsession. She took a step backward. You need to let me go before this becomes something worse. It's already something worse. Caedric followed her movement. And letting you go is an option I'm psychologically capable of choosing. So we move forward, together, into whatever nightmare this becomes. Because apparently I'd rather burn everything than watch you leave. He meant every word. Could see in her eyes that she recognized he meant every word. And that was the moment. The point of no return. Where transaction became possession. Where arrangement became obsession. Where functional predator became something infinitely more dangerous. Because monsters don't love, but they absolutely possess. And possession, once established, consumes everything. The week following the assassination attempt transformed Ashborne Hall from estate into fortress. Guards patrolled every corridor, servants moved under constant surveillance. No one entered or left without documentation Caedric personally reviewed. The house breathed paranoia-like atmosphere, thick enough to choke on. Seraphina stopped arguing about leaving. Not because she accepted the situation, because she recognized that arguing with obsession was like arguing with gravity, pointless expenditure of energy against force that didn't negotiate. Instead, she retreated into careful distance, speaking only when necessary, avoiding library corners where they'd once debated philosophy, maintaining ice-cold civility that felt more devastating than open hostility. Caedric noticed, couldn't not notice. But acknowledging her withdrawal required admitting he'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and that admission meant confronting what he'd become. So he worked instead, 18-hour days reviewing security protocols, investigating the breach, rebuilding political alliances he'd damaged, motion as medication, activity as anesthetic, anything to avoid the hollow space growing in his chest where certainty used to live. Dorian's investigation revealed the assassins were hired through intermediary network that dead-ended at foreign operative working for French industrial interests, hoping to destabilize English. Manufacturing. Standard economic warfare dressed as political violence. The explanation was neat. Too neat. Caedric had spent lifetime recognizing when stories fit together too perfectly, when convenient conclusions masked inconvenient truths. But he was exhausted from fighting on every front simultaneously, and accepting the foreign conspiracy theory meant avoiding harder questions about domestic enemies. So he accepted it, filed it away, moved forward. That was the first mistake. Marcus arrived at Caedric's study 3 weeks later, carrying ledger with expression that meant someone had miscalculated spectacularly, and he'd been designated messenger. Your Grace, we have significant problem. Define significant. Caedric didn't look up from correspondence detailing parliamentary maneuvering around his safety regulation reversal. Financial discrepancy across 3 holding companies. Marcus set the ledger down with deliberate care. Someone's been moving funds, small amounts over 18 months, totaling approximately £400,000. The number made Caedric's hand stop mid-signature. That's not discrepancy. That's embezzlement. Who had access? That's the problem. Marcus's voice went quiet. Authorization codes suggest transactions were approved at highest level. Your codes. Your grace. Your personal authorization. Caedric looked up slowly. I authorized no such transactions. Then someone replicated your codes, which means someone inside your inner circle. Someone with access to private documentation, security protocols, personal correspondence. He paused. Someone you trust completely. The implications settled like poison. Caedric's inner circle consisted of exactly 4 people. Marcus himself, Dorian, his mother Eleanor, and increasingly Seraphina. Anyone else operated at distances that made replicating personal authorization codes functionally impossible. Pull records on everyone with private study access over last 2 years, Caedric said flatly. Every person, every entry, every document they could have accessed, and do it quietly. No alerts, no warnings. I want to know who's been in position to compromise my codes before they realize we're investigating. Marcus nodded and withdrew, leaving Caedric alone with Ledger, detailing systematic betrayal executed over 18 months. While he'd been too focused on expansion to notice foundations eroding beneath him, £400,000. Enough to fund private army, enough to buy parliamentary seats, enough to destroy industrial competitor or purchase loyalties Caedric thought he'd secured through fear and efficiency. And someone inside his house had been stealing it methodically, patiently, with surgical precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of his financial architecture. He spent the next 6 hours reviewing records himself, cross-referencing dates and amounts with his own activities. Pattern emerged slowly, then suddenly, then with devastating clarity. The embezzlement intensified during periods when Caedric traveled for business, when his attention divided across multiple crises, when household management fell to trusted lieutenants who operated with his implicit authorization. And the authorization codes weren't perfect replicas. They were actual codes used legitimately for transactions that would have appeared routine if anyone bothered checking, which meant the thief wasn't an external threat who'd infiltrated security. It was someone whose access was authorized because Caedric had personally granted it, someone he'd trusted completely. The realization hit like physical blow. Because trust was currency Caedric rarely spent. He'd built empire on assumption that loyalty was transaction. People obeyed because disobedience carried consequences, not because they believed in his leadership. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped questioning the 4 people closest to him. Had stopped verifying their loyalty because verifying felt like admitting vulnerability. And that laziness, that human weakness, had created openings someone exploited for 18 months. Marcus's full investigation took 3 days. Results arrived via sealed report delivered to Caedric's private chambers at midnight when households slept and corridors carried only guard footsteps and gas lamp hiss. Caedric read in silence, working through documentation that painted picture with brutal clarity. The embezzlement began 19 months ago, shortly after Caedric's father died under suspicious circumstances officially ruled as heart failure. Transactions were authorized using codes that matched Caedric's personal security protocols exactly. Not replications, but authentic credentials accessed through private study documentation. Study access during relevant periods was restricted to 4 individuals: Marcus, Dorian, Eleanor, and a state manager named Thomas Whitmore, who'd served House Ashborne for 30 years. Cross-referencing financial movements with household schedules eliminated Marcus immediately. He'd been traveling with Caedric during 6 key transactions, physically impossible to execute them personally. Dorian remained suspect longer, but investigation revealed he'd been conducting military training exercises during 4 transactions, witnessed by 20 soldiers who confirmed his presence, which left Eleanor and Whitmore. Caedric's mother had access to everything, had helped build Ashborne financial empire, knew every system intimately. Whitmore managed daily operations, handled correspondence, coordinated household functions. Either could have done it, but only one had motive that made strategic sense. The report's final section detailed communications Marcus had uncovered through careful examination of household correspondence. Letters between Whitmore and parties identified as French industrial representatives, discussions about destabilizing Ashborne interests, references to payments contingent on successful intelligence gathering. And most damning, a letter dated 2 months before the assassination attempt, discussing how removing Caedric entirely would accelerate timeline, but increased risk assessment suggested waiting for better opportunity. The estate manager who'd served his family for 3 decades was French asset, had been for years, working systematically to destroy everything Caedric built from inside the structure itself. The betrayal was elegant, professional, absolutely devastating in its patience and precision. Caedric set down the report and stared at nothing while rage and something colder than rage fought for control of his response. Rage wanted immediate confrontation, violence, public execution that sent message about consequence of betrayal. The colder thing wanted understanding first, wanted to know how deep this went. Who else was compromised? What other damage had been done while he'd been fighting visible enemies and ignoring threat inside his house? The colder thing won, because rage was emotional response. And Caedric had spent lifetime training himself that emotional responses were luxuries that got you killed. He summoned Whitmore to his study at dawn, timing chosen deliberately to catch the man off guard before household fully woke. Dorian positioned himself outside the door, armed but discreet. Marcus waited in an adjacent room, ready to document confession if they extracted one. Whitmore entered with usual professional deference, slightly surprised by early summons but showing no visible concern. He was 60, gray-haired, physically unremarkable, the kind of functionary who became invisible through sheer administrative competence. "Your Grace?" he said calmly. "How can I assist?" Caedric remained seated behind his desk, hands folded, expression giving away nothing. "I've been reviewing estate finances. Found some irregularities. Thought you might help clarify." "Of course. What sort of irregularities?" "Unauthorized fund transfers. Small amounts over extended period, totaling approximately £400,000. He watched Whitmore's face carefully. "Any idea how that could happen?" For a fraction of a second, less than heartbeat, something flickered across the estate manager's expression. Not fear. Recognition. The micro-expression of someone who'd been caught but hadn't decided whether to run or fight. Then his face smoothed into professional concern. "That's alarming, Your Grace. I'll investigate immediately. If there's been breach of financial controls..." "Stop!" Caedric's voice went dead flat. "We're past performance. I know you did it. Have documentation. Have communications. Have timeline. What I don't have is why. So you're going to explain why 3 decades of loyal service ended with you selling out to French interests trying to destroy everything my family built." The silence that followed was absolute. Whitmore stood perfectly still, calculating odds, weighing options. Finally, something in his posture shifted. Not surrender. Strategic pivot. He sat down uninvited. That was first admission of guilt, abandoning pretense of proper deference. "Your father killed my son," Whitmore said quietly. 16 years ago. Called it accident during factory inspection. Said machinery malfunction. Paid compensation and closed investigation. But I knew. Everyone knew. Your father ordered safety inspections falsified to meet production quotas. My son died because Duke Ashborne valued efficiency over human life. Caedric's expression didn't change, but something in his chest went cold. "I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know. That was the point. Your father built empire on bodies he made sure stayed buried deep enough that heir wouldn't question inheritance. He destroyed dozens of families, hundreds maybe. All in service of accumulation he convinced himself was legacy rather than pathology. And you waited 16 years for revenge? I waited for appropriate opportunity." Whitmore's voice carried no anger, just flat recitation of strategic calculation. Your father was too paranoid to penetrate. But you were so focused on proving you were different from him, so determined to build through intelligence rather than brutality, that you stopped checking foundations. You trusted me because I was invisible, because good servants don't get questioned, and that trust gave me access to everything. The £400,000 went to competitors, activists, reformers, anyone positioned to pressure you into policies that weakened Ashborne control. The safety regulations you implemented? I helped fund the Parliamentary coalition that made them politically necessary. The assassination attempt? I provided architectural plans that got those men inside your house. He smiled without warmth. I've spent 18 months systematically destroying what your father built, and you helped me do it by being just human enough to miss the threat. Caedric stood slowly. Where's the money now? Distributed. untraceable, spent on damage that can't be undone. You can kill me, probably will, but it won't recover the funds or repair the political damage or prevent the investigation. Parliament's planning to launch into whether your recent moral awakening is genuine or strategic manipulation. What investigation? The one I've been feeding information to for 6 months. Anonymous tips about Ashborne business practices. Documentation of your father's crimes. Questions about whether son is truly reforming or simply better at hiding corruption. It launches next week, and when it does, every industrial lord you've crushed over the years will use it as opportunity to dismantle your empire piece by piece. He stood, moving toward the door. So kill me if it makes you feel better. But know that my death changes nothing. The damage is done. Your father's sins are about to become public record. And you'll spend next decade defending legacy built on corpses while pretending to be reformer. That's justice. Not clean, not satisfying, but justice nonetheless. Dorian burst through the door, sword drawn, ready to stop Whitmore's exit. Caedric raised one hand. Let him go. Your Grace, he just confessed to... Let him go! Repeat of command, harder this time. Dorian stepped aside, confused but obedient. Whitmore paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you're better man than your father. Not good, but better. Maybe that's worth something. Maybe it's just different flavor of destruction. But my son is still dead either way. And someone needed to make you understand that efficiency has cost beyond balance sheets. He left, and Caedric stood alone in his study while dawn light cut through windows, illuminating dust particles that danced like ashes from structure burning slowly enough you didn't notice until everything collapsed. Marcus entered moments later. Should we stop him? Alert authorities? He can't have gotten far. No. Caedric moved to the window overlooking estate grounds, where Whitmore was already crossing toward outer gates. Let him go. He destroyed you, methodically, over 18 months, and you're just letting him walk away? Yes. Why? Because he's right. Caedric's voice came out hollow. My father killed his son, covered it up, paid compensation like human life was transaction you could settle with money. And I inherited that empire without questioning what it cost, without asking whose bodies provided foundation. I thought being more strategic than my father made me better. But better slave trader is still slave trader. Better predator is still predator. And someone needed to make me see that clearly enough I couldn't rationalize it away. So what now? Marcus looked lost. We can't just absorb £400,000 loss in parliamentary investigation without response. Now we do exactly what Whitmore expects us to do. Caedric turned from the window. We defend, we fight, we try to preserve what's left. And we probably fail because empire built on compromised foundation eventually collapses no matter how well you maintain surface. There was a long silence. You're giving up, Marcus said finally. No. Caedric's voice hardened. I'm acknowledging reality. There's difference. Giving up means surrender. Reality means understanding that some damage can't be repaired by same methods that caused it. My father built this through brutality, masked as business. I've maintained it through strategy masked as reform. Neither approach actually addressed foundational rot. So yes, empire is collapsing. And I can either go down fighting to preserve something diseased, or I can let it collapse and build something different from ruins. What kind of something? Don't know yet. But probably something that doesn't require hiding bodies or paying off grieving fathers or rationalizing human cost as acceptable collateral. Marcus studied him with expression mixing concern and something like pity. Seraphina changed you. You know that, right? 6 months ago, you'd have killed Whitmore and buried the investigation and moved forward without conscience. Now you're having moral crisis about industrial practices that every factory owner in England considers standard. She didn't change me. Caedric moved back to his desk, suddenly exhausted. She just asked questions I'd been avoiding. Whitmore answered them with consequences I couldn't rationalize away. Together they destroyed certainty I'd been using as armor. And now I'm standing here without armor watching everything I built burn while trying to decide if saving it is even worth the additional cost. The study door opened. Seraphina entered without knocking, hair loose, dressed in morning gown that suggested she'd come directly from her quarters. Her face carried expression Caedric couldn't immediately interpret. I heard shouting, she said quietly. Guards outside won't tell me what happened. But I heard Whitmore's name, and now he's gone. And you look like someone's died." She looked between Caedric and Marcus. "What happened?" Caedric gestured for Marcus to leave. His secretary departed reluctantly, closing the door behind him. "Whitmore was embezzling," Caedric said flatly, "for 18 months, approximately £400,000, funding enemies, activists, parliamentary opposition. He just confessed. I let him go." Seraphina blinked. "You let him go? After he stole from you and tried to destroy you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was right." Caedric sat down heavily. "My father killed his son, covered it up, and Whitmore spent 16 years planning revenge sophisticated enough that I helped him execute it. That's not crime. That's consequence. And I don't get to punish people for holding me accountable for sins I inherited and perpetuated." She moved closer, studying his face. "You're not making sense. Yesterday you were ready to kill anyone who threatened me. Today you're letting your estate manager walk away after systematic betrayal? Those aren't contradictory positions." He looked up at her. "Whitmore betrayed empire built on bodies. Your person who made me see the bodies clearly. One deserves consequence. One deserves protection. My psychology can hold both truths simultaneously, even if they appear inconsistent." Seraphina sat down across from him. What else did he say? "The parliamentary investigation launches next week. That my father's crimes will become public record. That I'll spend years defending legacy I no longer believe in while pretending to be reformer. I'm not capable of actually being." She watched something crack in his expression. "That I'm better than my father, but better monster is still monster and his son is still dead either way." "And you believe him?" "I believe the facts. Believe the documentation. Believe that I've been so focused on proving I was different from my father that I stopped questioning whether different was actually better or just differently destructive." He leaned back, staring at ceiling. "You asked me once what I feared. I said, the day I stopped deserving you. Turns out, I never deserved you. Never deserved anything except consequences I've been avoiding through strategic competence and inherited wealth. That's self-pity dressed as accountability." "No." Caedric's voice went sharp. "That's man watching his certainty collapse in real time. Watching empire built by 3 generations revealed as crime syndicate with better paperwork. Watching every rationalization exposed as lie comfortable enough I could sleep at night. That's not self-pity. That's devastation. And I don't have framework for processing devastation because I've spent lifetime avoiding any experience that might produce it." Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." First honest answer he'd given. "Parliamentary investigation launches regardless. Industrial coalition my father built will see this as weakness to exploit. Financial losses from embezzlement will take years to recover. And I'm sitting here questioning whether recovering is even goal worth pursuing, or if I should just let the whole structure collapse and walk away." "Walk away to what?" "Something that doesn't require calculating acceptable body count before breakfast. Something that doesn't force me to defend father's atrocities because admitting them destroys inheritance. Something that lets me sleep without nightmares about 16-year-old kids dying in factories because efficiency mattered more than safety." He looked at her directly. "You've been asking me to change for months, challenging assumptions, forcing questions, making me see clearly. This is what change looks like when it actually happens. Not gentle evolution. Violent disintegration of everything I thought I knew, followed by complete uncertainty about what comes after. And I have no idea if I'm strong enough to survive it." The vulnerability in his voice was unprecedented, raw. The kind of admission that would have been impossible 6 months ago when certainty armored him against doubt. Seraphina reached across the desk, her hand covering his. "This is the first time you've spoken to me like person instead of possession. I know, it's terrifying, for both of us." He didn't pull his hand away. "Because person means partnership, means vulnerability, means trusting you won't destroy me when I give you every weapon necessary to do it. And trust is currency I've never learned to spend without immediate calculated return. So learn. How? By starting here." She squeezed his hand once, by telling me what you actually need instead of declaring what you'll take, by asking instead of commanding, by accepting that I might say no and staying anyway because partnership matters more than control. And if I can't, if obsession is too strong and possession is only language my psychology speaks fluently, then we'll fail. She said it simply, without judgment, But at least we'll fail honestly instead of successfully maintaining prison you've built from fear and inheritance. Outside, morning sun illuminated Ashbourne Hall's grounds with light that felt wrong for the magnitude of internal collapse, happening in study where Duke, who'd controlled everything, was learning that control was always illusion. Just very convincing one. Until it wasn't. Yes. The parliamentary investigation launched exactly as Whitmore promised 2 weeks later, with coordinated press coverage that ensured maximum public attention. Headlines screamed about Ashbourne atrocities, factory deaths covered up, families paid off, industrial empire built on systematic brutality disguised as business practice. Lords who'd feared Caedric for years sensed blood in water. They circled, demanded inquiries, called for criminal prosecution, moved to seize market share while Ashbourne influence weakened. Caedric could have fought, could have deployed every dirty trick his father taught him, could have exposed enemies' hypocrisy, revealed their crimes, demonstrated that every industrial house in England had bodies buried in foundations. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He cooperated, provided documentation, testified honestly, admitted his father's crimes without deflection or rationalization, acknowledged that safety regulations he'd implemented came too late to save lives already lost. The political establishment didn't know how to process honesty from man they'd expected to fight like cornered animal. His industrial coalition viewed cooperation as ultimate betrayal. They abandoned him wholesale, reforming alliances specifically designed to exclude House Ashbourne from northern trade networks he'd spent decades dominating. Within 6 weeks, everything he'd built was dismantled, not destroyed, dismantled, systematically, piece by piece, until what remained was estate, title, and personal fortune reduced by 3/4, but still substantial enough to maintain lifestyle, just not empire. Through it all, Seraphina stayed, not because arrangement required it, because she chose to. She watched him lose everything with same steady presence she'd brought to their philosophical debates, offering neither pity nor praise, just presence. Just the acknowledgement that person losing everything deserved companion willing to witness collapse without running. And Caedric learned something his father never taught him, that sometimes losing is only way to discover what actually matters. That empire built on bodies wasn't worth defending once you actually looked at bodies clearly. That person who stays when you have nothing is more valuable than 1,000 people who kneel when you have everything. The night the final investigation concluded, recommending massive fines and permanent oversight, but stopping short of criminal prosecution, Caedric found Seraphina in the library reading philosophy by candlelight. "It's over," he said quietly. "Empire's gone. Influence destroyed. Everything my family spent generations building is scattered to competitors who'll probably be investigated themselves within 5 years for identical practices." She looked up. "How do you feel?" "Terrified. Relieved. Empty." He sat down beside her, lost in ways I don't have vocabulary to describe because I've never been lost before. Always knew what came next, what strategy to deploy, what enemy to crush. Now I don't know anything except that certainty was prison and freedom is fucking terrifying when you've never experienced it. What will you do now? Don't know? He looked at her directly. What would partnership suggest? Partnership suggests we decide together. She closed the book. But first you tell me what you actually want. Not what's strategic, not what preserves status. What you want as person instead of as Duke, maintaining appearance. Caedric was quiet for a very long time, then said the words that would have killed him 6 months ago. "I want to deserve you, want to build something that doesn't require hiding bodies or rationalizing brutality. Want to wake up without calculating whose suffering funds my breakfast. And I want to do that with you. Not as possession, as partner. If you'll stay knowing I'll probably fail repeatedly because I'm learning language I should have learned decades ago." Seraphina studied his face. "That's the first time you've asked me for anything without assuming my compliance." "I know. It's still terrifying, for both of us." He reached for her hand, hesitant, the gesture carrying question marks instead of commands. "But maybe terror is better than certainty that requires constant violence to maintain." She took his hand. And in a library full of books containing philosophies about power and governance and human nature, 2 people who'd started as transaction learned that sometimes the most radical thing powerful person can do is admit powerlessness. That losing everything is only way to discover what can't be taken. That person who challenges you to become better is more valuable than empire that requires you to remain worse. The Ashborne Empire was gone, but something else was being built in its ruins. Something that didn't have name yet, something that looked like partnership instead of possession, something that required vulnerability instead of control. And for a man who'd spent lifetime believing vulnerability was death sentence, that was most terrifying transformation possible, but also the only one worth surviving for. The letter arrived 3 months after the empire collapsed, delivered by courier who refused to identify his employer and disappeared before Caedric could question him further. Plain envelope. No seal. Just his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet containing 5 words that made his blood go cold. They have your mother. Come alone. No signature. No demands. No location. Just threat implicit enough to be undeniable. Caedric read it twice while standing in what remained of his study, surrounded by emptier bookshelves and furniture he'd sold to cover fines. His hand stayed steady, but something in his chest constricted with recognition that vulnerability he'd finally accepted was now being weaponized exactly as he'd always feared. He found Seraphina in the garden she'd been cultivating, dirt under her nails, hair tied back, looking more alive than she ever had during their transactional arrangement. She'd stayed through collapse, helped him navigate investigations, watched him learn to be human instead of calculating machine. And now that humanity was about to cost something neither of them had prepared for. "We need to talk," he said quietly. She stood, reading his expression with accuracy that came from months of learning his tells. "What happened?" He handed her the letter. Her face went pale. "When?" "Courier delivered it 10 minutes ago. Gone before I could get information." He took the letter back. "This is retaliation. Some lord I destroyed coming back now that I'm weakened. Using my mother as leverage to finish what Parliamentary investigation started. Or its trap." She moved closer. "Designed to draw you out, kill you, eliminate Ashborne line completely. Probably both." Caedric's voice stayed level, but his mind was already calculating angles. "Doesn't matter. She's my mother. Whatever damage I've caused, whatever empire I've lost, whatever reformation I'm attempting, she doesn't deserve to die for my sins. You can't go alone. The letter says, the letter is designed to isolate you." She grabbed his arm. "You go alone, you die. They kill you. They kill her anyway. You need backup, need strategy, need time to investigate who sent this and where she's being held. I don't have time. Every hour they hold her is hour they can hurt her, torture her, use her as message about what happens when Ashborne power collapses." He pulled away gently. "I've spent 3 months learning to be a better person. Learning partnership, learning vulnerability. But vulnerability doesn't mean stupidity. And letting my mother die to prove I've changed would be cowardice dressed as wisdom. Then let me come with you." "No." The word came out harder than intended. "You stay here. Stay safe. This is consequence of life I led before you. My damage. My responsibility. And I won't make you collateral in war that started before we met." So after everything, after months of learning partnership, you're just reverting to isolation the moment stakes get real? "I'm protecting you. There's difference." "No, there isn't." Her voice went sharp. "Protection that requires my exclusion isn't partnership. It's control with better marketing. You want to face this? Fine. But face it honestly. Don't pretend you're protecting me when what you're actually doing is reverting to psychological patterns you've spent months trying to unlearn." The accusation hit because it was accurate. Caedric was reverting, could feel old patterns reasserting themselves. The certainty that he alone could handle crisis. The assumption that protecting people meant excluding them from danger. The fundamental belief that isolation was strength rather than weakness. 3 months of growth collapsing under pressure into familiar shapes. "You're right," he said finally. "You're absolutely right. And I don't know how to reconcile old instincts with new learning when stakes are this high. So tell me what partnership looks like here. Tell me how we handle this together without getting you killed." Seraphina took his hand. "We start by not assuming you're only person capable of strategic thinking. We investigate together, plan together, face consequences together. That's what partnership means when it's tested. And if that gets you hurt, then I'm hurt. That's my risk to take." Her grip tightened. "You don't get to protect me from my own choices. That's still control, just gentler version." He studied her face, seeing determination that matched his own, and realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't possession anymore. Wasn't ward or potential wife or convenient alliance. She was equal, And equals didn't get protected by being excluded. They got respected by being included. All right, he said quietly. We do this together, but we do it smart. No rushing in, no emotional reactions. We treat this like military operation with every precaution. Agreed. She released his hand. Where do we start? Dorian. If anyone can track where this came from, he can. They found Dorian in the stables maintaining weapons he'd kept, despite Empire's collapse. Loyal through devastation in ways that reminded Caedric that some men followed leadership rather than wealth. He listened to the situation without interrupting, face hardening as implications became clear. This is Lord Chancellor Pembroke, Dorian said immediately. Has to be. You humiliated him 3 years ago, forced his resignation, destroyed his political career. He's been waiting for opening like this. Pembroke's in exile. Caedric frowned. Last I heard, he was bankrupt and living in Scotland. Men like Pembroke don't stay bankrupt. They rebuild quietly, make alliances with your enemies. Wait for perfect moment. Dorian checked his pistol's action mechanically. Your empire collapsing was that moment. He probably saw vulnerability and organized coalition. Multiple lords who hate you pooling resources for final strike. Can you find him? Give me 6 hours. Dorian stood. I still have contacts, people who owe me favors. I'll trace the courier, identify likely locations, build target list. But your grace, he looked at Caedric directly. Once we find him, this becomes violent. These people took your mother. They're not negotiating. They're executing vendetta. You go in. You're going in for blood. I understand. Do you? Because 3 months ago you let Whitmore walk away after he destroyed you. Now you're preparing for war. That's significant regression in personal growth. It's not regression. Caedric's voice went cold. Whitmore had legitimate grievance. His son died because of my father's crimes. That deserved acknowledgement, not punishment. But Pembroke, he's attacking because I humiliated him politically, because I wounded his pride. That's not justice, that's sadism. And sadism against my family doesn't get philosophical consideration. It gets brutal response. Seraphina spoke quietly. And what's the difference between that brutal response and the brutality your father would have deployed? The question hung in the air like blade. Caedric was quiet for a long moment, examining motivations with honesty that had become habit through months of Seraphina's challenges. Intent? He said finally. My father would have enjoyed the brutality, would have made it excessive to send message. I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm going to do what's necessary to retrieve my mother and ensure this doesn't happen again. That's not sadism. That's consequence. Measured, proportional, necessary. But still violent, she pressed. Yes, still violent. He met her eyes. I've spent 3 months learning to be a better person, but better doesn't mean harmless, doesn't mean passive, doesn't mean letting people hurt my family because violence contradicts reformation. It means using violence strategically rather than habitually, with regret rather than pleasure, as last resort rather than first response. That's rationalization. No, that's boundary. He moved closer. You've taught me that rationalizations collapse under examination. I've examined this. My mother is innocent. She's being tortured to hurt me. That requires response. Not because I enjoy violence, because failing to respond communicates that attacking Ashborne family carries no consequence, and that communication invites escalation. So yes, I'm going to be violent, strategically, necessarily, and I'll regret it afterward because I'm not my father. But I'll do it anyway because protection of family isn't negotiable principle. Dorian watched the exchange with expression mixing approval and concern. That's most honest assessment of necessary violence I've heard from you, Your Grace. Almost healthy, except for the part where you're about to walk into trap that might kill everyone involved. Then help me make a trap. They regret springing. Caedric turned back to him. 6 hours. Find location. Identify numbers. Give me actionable intelligence. Then we plan extraction that gets my mother out alive and sends message clear enough no one tries this again. And if they've already killed her? Seraphina asked quietly. If this entire thing is designed to draw you to location where there's nothing except ambush, then I die knowing I tried. Caedric's voice carried finality. That's better death than living with knowledge I abandoned my mother to torture because I was too reformed to fight back. Some principles are worth killing for. Some people are worth dying for. And family, however complicated, however damaged, falls in that category. He looked between them. I'm not asking you to approve. I'm not even asking you to help. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and hoping you understand why. Because this is exactly the kind of situation where old patterns and new learning collide. And I'm choosing to honor both. The old pattern that says family is non-negotiable. The new learning that says violence should be last resort executed with regret rather than satisfaction. If that's contradiction you can't reconcile, I understand. But it's reality I'm operating within. Seraphina studied him for a very long moment, then nodded slowly. I understand. And I'm coming with you. No. Yes. Her voice went hard. You don't protect me by excluding me. You respect me by letting me choose my risk. I'm choosing to face this with you. That's partnership. Accept it or admit you're still controlling. The truth of it hit like physical blow. She was right. And he hated that she was right because it meant accepting vulnerability he'd spent lifetime avoiding. Fine, he said finally. You come. But you follow tactical protocols. You don't take unnecessary risks. You stay behind defensive positions. And if I say run, you run without argument. Same conditions apply to you, she countered. I'm trained for this, and I'm invested in your survival. So we protect each other, or neither of us goes. Choose. Caedric looked at woman who'd spent 6 months systematically dismantling every defense mechanism he'd built and realized that partnership meant accepting that protection was mutual rather than hierarchical. All right, we protect each other. He extended his hand. Partners. She took it. Partners. Dorian watched with expression that might have been approval. I'll get you intelligence. You two plan how not to die using it. He headed for the door, paused. And your grace? Whatever happens, you're not your father. What you're about to do? It's ugly, but it's not sadistic. That distinction matters even when blood is the same color. He left them standing in stables that smelled of hay and leather and old violence, preparing for new violence that would test whether reformation survived when stakes became lethal. Muck. Dorian returned in 5 hours with intelligence that painted grim picture. Pembroke had indeed organized coalition, 7 lords who'd suffered under Ashborne dominance, pooling resources for a coordinated strike. Eleanor was being held at abandoned factory 20 miles north, same factory where Whitmore's son had died 16 years ago. The symbolism was deliberate. The location was defensible nightmare. Multiple entry points, high ground for shooters, open floor plan that made cover minimal. They'd chosen it specifically to maximize casualties if Caedric brought force and maximize vulnerability if he came alone. Perfect killing ground. Dorian spread architectural drawings across what remained of Caedric's study desk. They'll have shooters on catwalks here and here. Main floor will be trapped or heavily guarded. They'll keep your mother central, visible but inaccessible. Classic hostage scenario designed to make rescue functionally impossible. How many men? Caedric studied the layout with tactical eye his father had trained into him. 20 minimum, possibly 30. All armed, all motivated by hatred that's been building for years. He traced assault routes with finger. We could bring matching force. Storm the building. Overwhelmed through superior numbers. Too slow, Caedric said immediately. They'd kill her the moment we breached. And casualties would be catastrophic. We need precision, not power. Then what? Seraphina leaned over the drawings. Because precision requires detailed intelligence we don't have. We don't know exact positions, don't know their protocols, don't know trigger conditions for executing hostage. We create chaos, Caedric said slowly. Force them to react rather than execute planned ambush. Get inside their decision cycle. Make them improvise. How? Dorian looked skeptical. You walk in alone, they shoot you. You walk in with army, they shoot her. You need third option that doesn't exist. Caedric stared at this factory layout while his mind worked through scenarios with speed that came from lifetime of strategic thinking. Pembroke wanted humiliation, wanted to hurt him publicly. That meant spectacle, meant audience, meant opportunity. What if I give them what they want? He said quietly. Public humiliation, confession, acknowledgement of every crime my father committed, everything they've wanted to hear for years. That's suicide, Dorian said flatly. You confess publicly to crimes significant enough, they'll execute you regardless. Not if confession is distraction. Caedric pointed at architectural details. While I'm confessing on main floor, drawing all attention, You and Seraphina infiltrate through service entrance here. Move through sublevels. Access catwalks from below. You eliminate shooters silently. Get into position to extract my mother while attention is focused on my performance downstairs. You're using yourself as bait, Seraphina said slowly. I'm using their expectations as weakness. They want me broken. Want me confessing. Want spectacle of Ashborne Duke destroyed publicly. I'll give them that performance while you execute actual rescue. By the time they realize it's distraction, we'll have my mother secured and multiple exit routes available. Dorian studied the plan with professional eye. It could work. Barely. Requires perfect timing. Requires you keeping their attention long enough we can move through entire building. Requires them being so focused on humiliating you they ignore security protocols. It requires me being convincing, Caedric said quietly. Being actually broken rather than performing broken. And after 3 months of collapse, that won't be difficult. I am broken. I have lost everything. I do carry guilt for my father's crimes. I'll just weaponize that honesty into theater they believe completely. Seraphina touched his arm. This is dangerous beyond anything we've discussed. If timing is wrong by 30 seconds, you die. If we do nothing, my mother dies. He covered her hand with his, and I've spent 3 months learning that some things matter more than safety. Family is one. Partnership is another. And proving that reformation doesn't mean cowardice is third. So yes, it's dangerous. But it's also right. And I'm tired of calculating whether right action serves strategic interests. Sometimes right is just right, and you do it anyway. The words would have been impossible 6 months ago, when everything was calculation and nothing was principle. But 3 months of collapse had taught him that principles were only real when they cost something, and this was about to cost everything. They moved on the factory at midnight, Caedric approaching from front, while Dorian and Seraphina circled toward service entrance. The building rose from landscape like monument to industrial decay. Broken windows reflecting moonlight, rusted machinery visible through collapsed walls. Caedric walked alone across open ground, hands visible. No weapons except knife concealed at his back. Insufficient for fighting, but enough for final option if everything collapsed. He'd spent the carriage ride preparing psychologically, not for deception, but for honesty. Everything he was about to say would be true. Every confession genuine. Every admission of guilt legitimate. The only lie was that truth was surrender rather than tactic. Guards met him 50 yards from entrance, rifles trained center mass, professional in way that confirmed these weren't hired thugs, but military veterans organized for specific purpose. I'm here for my mother, Caedric said clearly. Alone is requested. Whatever you want to say, whatever confession you need, I'll give it. Just let her go unharmed. The guard said nothing, simply escorted him inside through doors that opened onto factory floor, transformed into tribunal. Torches lined the space. 20 men stood armed at intervals, each one representing house or interest that had suffered under Ashborne control. And at the center, tied to chair on raised platform, was Eleanor. She looked beaten, bruised, but alive. Her eyes met Caedric's with expression mixing relief and fury, and something else he couldn't immediately identify. Warning, maybe. Lord Chancellor Pembroke emerged from shadows at factory's far end, older than Caedric remembered, thinner, but burning with rage that years hadn't diminished. Duke Ashborne, he said, voice echoing through empty space. Or should I say former Duke, stripped of empire, diminished in wealth, reduced to begging for family members' life. How does it feel to be powerless? Terrifying, Caedric said honestly, and clarifying. Power I had wasn't worth what it cost. People it hurt. Lives it destroyed. Legacy it created. You wanted me broken? I'm broken. Empire is gone. Influence scattered. Everything my family built is dismantled. So if this is about revenge, you've already won. Let her go. You think this is about winning? Pembroke moved closer. This is about justice. About every lord you've humiliated, every family you've destroyed, every crime you committed while hiding behind wealth and influence. Tonight you answer for all of it. Then let me answer. Caedric raised his hand slightly. You want confession, public acknowledgement? I'll give it. My father killed workers through deliberate safety violations, paid off families, buried evidence, built empire on bodies he made sure stayed buried deep enough no one questioned success. And I inherited that empire without questioning cost until it was too late. I am guilty of perpetuating system designed to crush anyone who challenged it. I am responsible for damage caused even after I knew better. So prosecute me. Execute me if that's what justice requires. Just let my mother go. She's guilty of nothing except loving son who spent lifetime being monster. The confession rang through factory floor with weight of absolute honesty. Because it was true. All of it. And Pembroke recognized that truth with expression mixing satisfaction and confusion. You're not fighting, he said slowly. Not threatening, not even defending yourself. What happened to the Obsidian Duke who crushed anyone who challenged him? He learned that crushing people isn't actually strength. Caedric's voice stayed level. That empire built on fear eventually collapses when fear is insufficient. That some costs are too high, no matter what you gain. So yes, I'm not fighting. Because fighting is what got everyone into this situation. Cycle of violence and retaliation that has consumed decades and destroyed dozens. I'm choosing to end that cycle by accepting consequence without escalation. You expect me to believe reformation this complete? I don't expect anything. Caedric moved closer, drawing attention, playing his role perfectly. I'm just telling truth. You can accept it or reject it, kill me or release me. But either way, this ends tonight. No more retaliation, no more vendetta, just consequence and closure. Behind him, in service corridors he couldn't see, Dorian and Seraphina would be moving through darkness, climbing toward catwalks, positioning for silent elimination of guards whose attention was locked on drama playing out below. Timing was everything. Pembroke studied him with expression mixing hatred and uncertainty. You're very convincing, he said finally. Almost believable. But I know what you are, Ashborne. I know the monster behind the Reformation performance. And I'm not releasing your mother until you confess to every crime specifically. Every family destroyed, every worker killed, every bribe paid. All of it. Public record. So the world knows exactly what House Ashborne built its fortune on. Fine. Caedric didn't hesitate. Where do you want me to start? The beginning. Pembroke gestured at surrounding men. Tell them how your grandfather bought his title through coal mine that collapsed, killing 40 workers. How your father expanded through blackmail and coercion. How you maintained control through systematic destruction of anyone who challenged you. All of it. Every detail, every crime, every sin. And Caedric began. He spoke for 30 minutes, recounting every atrocity he knew, every crime he'd participated in or inherited, every family destroyed through Ashborne ambition. He didn't embellish, didn't minimize, just stated facts with clarity that came from months of examining those facts honestly. The men surrounding him listened with expressions mixing vindication and horror. Some had been victims themselves. Some had profited from similar methods. All recognized truth when they heard it. Somewhere above, in darkness and shadows, Dorian was eliminating guards with brutal efficiency while Seraphina moved toward Eleanor's position through routes only architectural plans revealed. Caedric couldn't see them, could only trust that partnership he'd built would hold under pressure, could only maintain performance that had transformed from tactic into confession into something closer to testimony. Because somewhere in the recitation of crimes, speaking them aloud in space where bodies had fallen, acknowledging cost without deflection or rationalization, he realized something fundamental. That accountability wasn't weakness. That admission of guilt was first step towards something better than what came before. That man who could look at own history and say, I was wrong, I am responsible. I accept consequence was stronger than man who defended every choice through rationalization. His father would have burned this factory to ground rather than admit error. Caedric stood in its center, confessing everything while trusting others to execute rescue he couldn't accomplish alone. That was evolution. Painful, humiliating, absolutely necessary. Above them, subtle sounds began. Not loud enough to draw attention, but present enough that trained ear might notice. Guard on western catwalk suddenly absent. Shadow moving where shadow shouldn't move. Seraphina's figure barely visible in torchlight reflected off broken machinery. Pembroke was too focused on Caedric's confession to notice, but Eleanor saw. And for the first time since Caedric entered, she smiled slightly. Then chaos exploded. Dorian dropped from catwalk directly onto eastern guard position, bladework transforming space into abattoir before alarm could be raised. Seraphina reached Eleanor, cutting her bonds with efficiency that came from practice rather than experience. And Pembroke realized he'd been played exactly 1 second too late. Kill them! He screamed. Kill them all! Caedric moved. The knife at his back came out in single fluid motion, crossing distance between him and Pembroke in heartbeat. not to kill, to disable. Blade entering shoulder rather than throat, dropping the Lord Chancellor without making him martyr. Around them, factory floor transformed into war zone. Guards converging, Dorian fighting three simultaneously. Seraphina covering Eleanor's retreat toward service entrance. Everything happening at speed that made thought impossible and instinct essential. And Caedric remembered every lesson his father taught him about close quarters combat, about fighting when outnumbered, about surviving when survival seemed impossible. He'd spent 3 months trying to be better than his father, but better than his father didn't mean harmless. It meant precise. He moved through guards with efficiency that was brutal but not excessive. Each strike designed to disable rather than kill. Each movement calculated to create space rather than body count. Fighting with regret rather than satisfaction, necessity rather than enjoyment, but fighting nonetheless. Because reformation didn't mean passivity. It meant choosing when violence was necessary and executing it without pleasure. Seraphina and Eleanor reached the service entrance, Dorian covering their exit with suppressing fire that drove guards back. Caedric fought toward them, taking hits that would bruise for weeks, delivering strikes that dropped opponents but left them breathing. Almost there. 10 more feet. 5. Then rifle report cracked through factory noise and everything went wrong. Seraphina collapsed. Not dramatically, just suddenly folding as shock and pain transformed stance into fall. Blood spreading across her shoulder where a bullet had found flesh. And Caedric felt something inside him that hadn't existed before 3 months ago, shatter with force that made physical wounds irrelevant. He reached her in seconds that felt like hours, covering her body with his, returning fire blindly while Dorian provided covering barrage. Eleanor was screaming, guards were closing, exit was compromised, and Seraphina was bleeding in his arms, looking at him with expression mixing pain and absolute trust that he'd get her out of this. Partnership meant mutual protection, meant facing consequences together, meant neither of them dying alone in factory built on blood. Caedric lifted her, felt her gasp of pain, and ran for service entrance, while Dorian maintained defensive fire that turned pursuit into casualties. They hit corridor at full sprint, guards behind them, exit ahead, Seraphina's blood soaking his shirt while she stayed conscious through willpower alone. Almost there, almost safe. Then door ahead burst open, and Marcus stood there with pistol aimed directly at Caedric's chest. His secretary, his trusted advisor, his friend for 6 years, standing between them and freedom with expression mixing regret and absolute determination. "I'm sorry, Your Grace," Marcus said quietly, "but this is where it ends. For all of you." Time fractured into heartbeats when Marcus stood blocking their escape, pistol steady despite expression carrying weight of betrayal, and something worse, inevitability. Behind them, factory floor echoed with guards regrouping, voices shouting coordinates, boots hammering stone. Ahead, the man Caedric had trusted with Empire's most intimate secrets held their survival in hands that trembled just enough to be human. Seraphina's blood soaked through Caedric's shirt where he held her against his chest, feeling her breath come shallow and fast against his neck. Eleanor stood frozen behind them. Dorian had pistol half raised but couldn't fire without hitting Marcus or compromising their only exit route. And Caedric felt something in his chest that wasn't panic or rage, but cold acceptance of pattern. He should have seen months ago when Whitmore confessed, that betrayal from those closest cuts deepest. Not because it's unexpected, but because some part of you always knew, and chose to ignore the signs because acknowledging them meant admitting you'd been wrong about fundamental judgments. "Marcus," he said quietly. His voice stayed level despite Seraphina's weight in his arms and blood loss making her body feel heavier with each second. "You don't want to do this. You're right. Marcus's gun didn't waver. I don't want to. But necessity doesn't care about preference. You taught me that 6 years ago when you ordered me to destroy Lord Harrington's reputation because he questioned your father's accounting practices. Remember? You said sometimes good people do ugly things because the alternative is worse. Well, Your Grace, I've decided the alternative of letting you leave here is worse than shooting you in this corridor." The guards were closing, maybe 30 seconds before they rounded corner and made conversation academic through overwhelming firepower. "What did they offer you?" Caedric asked. "What's worth 6 years of loyalty?" "They didn't offer me anything." Marcus's voice carried edge. "They showed me what you refused to see. That reformation you've been performing? It's temporary. Performance designed to rebuild reputation so you can consolidate power again. Every broken man says he's changed when empire collapses. Very few actually mean it, and I can't risk that you're one of the many rather than one of the few. So you allied with Pembroke? With coalition built on revenge rather than justice? I allied with future that doesn't include Ashborne dominance. Marcus shifted slightly. Your family has controlled northern England for 3 generations through brutality dressed as business. Your father was monster. You were calculating machine who learned to fake humanity. And even if reformation is genuine, which I doubt, your existence invites others to rebuild what you've torn down. So yes, I'm blocking your exit. Because sometimes good people have to make ugly choices. The philosophy sounded familiar because Caedric had said almost exactly same words dozens of times when ordering actions that destroyed lives for strategic advantage. Hearing them reflected back as justification for his own execution felt like cosmic punishment for every rationalization he'd deployed over years of control. Seraphina stirred in his arms, consciousness flickering. Her hand found his with pressure that communicated she was still present, still fighting, still trusting him to navigate impossible situation. And Caedric realized that man he'd been 6 months ago would have already killed Marcus without hesitation, would have calculated that friendship was tactical liability when it conflicted with survival, would have executed without regret because hesitation got you killed. But 3 months of collapse had taught him that some calculations destroyed what made survival worth achieving. That killing Marcus might save their immediate situation, but would confirm every fear his secretary harbored about whether reformation was genuine. That proving you've changed requires acting differently, even when reverting to old patterns would be strategically optimal. You're wrong about one thing, Caedric said quietly. I'm not performing reformation. I'm living it badly. Making mistakes. Reverting to patterns under pressure. But also learning that becoming a better person doesn't happen through perfect execution. It happens through repeatedly choosing different response even when instinct screams for familiar violence. Marcus's expression flickered. That's exactly what someone performing would say. Yes, it is. Which is why proving authenticity is impossible through words. He adjusted Seraphina's weight carefully. But here's what I can offer. Lower the gun. Let us pass. And I'll surrender to parliamentary custody tomorrow. No lawyers, no defense. Complete cooperation with investigation into every remaining Ashborne crime. You want me neutralized? I'll neutralize myself. Just let these people live. They're not responsible for my family's legacy. The guards were 15 seconds away. Dorian had clear shot at Marcus, but taking it meant condemning them all because gunfire would alert pursuers and eliminate surprise advantage. That's noble offer, Marcus said slowly. Also tactically brilliant. You surrender publicly, you become martyr. Reform movement rallies around you. Within 3 years, you're rebuilding influence through sympathy rather than fear. So know your grace. This ends here. Tonight, permanently. His finger tightened on trigger, and Eleanor stepped between them. Caedric's mother moved with speed that belied her years in recent captivity, positioning herself directly in firing line with expression, mixing maternal protection and something fiercer, absolute rejection of inevitability. If you're going to kill my son, Marcus, you'll do it after killing me. She stood perfectly straight despite bruises and exhaustion. And before you pull that trigger, understand what you're actually doing. You're not preventing future tyranny. You're executing man who spent 3 months learning to be human after a lifetime of being weapon. That's not justice. That's murder of possibility. And if you can live with that, then fire. But know that you're choosing to be exactly what you claim to oppose. The factory corridor held impossible tension. Guards approaching, Marcus's hand trembling, Seraphina bleeding, time collapsing into a single moment where every choice led to catastrophe. Then Dorian spoke with voice-carrying weight of man who'd seen too much violence to romanticize it anymore. Marcus, I've watched Duke Ashborne longer than you, fought beside him, killed for him, watched him destroy enemies without mercy. And I've also watched him change in ways that terrify him precisely because they're genuine. You want proof? He let Whitmore go. Man who destroyed his empire walked away alive because your grace acknowledged legitimate grievance. That's not performance. That's evolution so fundamental it contradicts every survival instinct he's cultivated. Marcus looked between them, calculation visible in his expression. The gun stayed raised, but certainty had fractured into doubt. And Caedric understood in that moment that survival sometimes required offering something more valuable than strategic advantage. Required vulnerability so absolute it bordered on suicide. Required trusting that humanity he'd been cultivating had actually taken root deep enough to withstand exposure. "You're right to doubt me," he said quietly. "Right to fear I'll revert. Right to believe reformation might be performance. Because I doubt it too. Fear it. Question whether I'm actually changing or just adapting tactics. But here's what I know absolutely. The woman in my arms is bleeding because she chose partnership with me. My mother is standing in firing line because she believes possibility matters more than certainty. And you're holding gun because you think preventing potential tyranny justifies killing people who haven't committed crimes yet." He met Marcus's eyes directly. "So, decide. Kill us and confirm that preemptive violence is acceptable when sufficiently righteous. Or lower the gun and accept that reformation is messy, uncertain, and requires granting people opportunity to prove change through actions rather than execution through suspicion. Either way, choose fast, because those guards are 5 seconds away, and everyone in this corridor dies if we're still standing here when they arrive." The words landed with weight of ultimatum that wasn't threat, but observation. Marcus stood frozen for heartbeat that felt eternal, then lowered the gun. "Go," he said quietly. "Service exit leads to drainage culvert. Follow it east half-mile to where I left horses. They're saddled and provisioned. Get the girl medical attention before she bleeds out." He looked at Caedric with expression mixing regret and something like hope. "And your grace? Prove me wrong. Spend next decade demonstrating that reformation was genuine rather than tactical. Because I'm betting everything on possibility, you're serious. Don't make me regret granting you chance to prove it." The guards rounded corner exactly as Dorian shoved Eleanor through exit, Caedric following with Seraphina, Marcus firing 3 shots that dropped pursuing guards and bought them seconds needed to clear doorway. Then he sealed it behind them with metal beam that would hold long enough. They ran through drainage culvert with Seraphina barely conscious, Eleanor supporting herself through willpower alone, Dorian covering rear with remaining ammunition. The culvert stank of industrial waste and old darkness, water ankle-deep and cold enough to shock nervous system into temporary alertness. Half-mile felt infinite when carrying wounded partner and elderly mother, while pursuit echoed through enclosed space. But horses materialized exactly where Marcus promised, and Caedric lifted Seraphina into saddle with movements that sent pain shooting through her shoulder based on sharp intake of breath she couldn't suppress. "We need doctor," Eleanor said, her voice carrying authority that transcended exhaustion. "That wound requires immediate treatment." "I know someone," Dorian replied. 20 miles south. Physician who owes me considerable favor and asks no questions." He helped Seraphina mount, then Eleanor, then swung onto his own horse. "But we need to move now before they organize pursuit with dogs." They rode into darkness with urgency that pushed horses close to limit, Caedric keeping Seraphina positioned in front of him so her weight wouldn't stress wounded shoulder, feeling her pulse against his chest and counting each heartbeat as reassurance she was still alive, still present, still fighting. The landscape blurred into nightmare geography of moonlit fields and shadowed forests, time marked only by hoofbeats and Seraphina's breathing and his own heartbeat thundering counterpoint to both. She spoke once during ride, voice barely audible over wind and motion. "You didn't kill Marcus." "No." "Why not?" "Because killing him would have confirmed everything he feared about me." Her blood was warm against his hands where he held her steady. "And because reformation requires proving change through choices that contradict instinct, even when those choices might get us killed. That's either very wise or very stupid, probably both." He held her tighter. "Don't die. That's not request. That's demand. Demanding things from me again?" Slight smile in her voice, despite pain. "Thought we established that's controlling behavior. Sue me for reverting under pressure. Just stay conscious long enough we can argue about my psychological regression properly." "Deal." She said nothing else, but her hand found his and squeezed once with strength that felt like promise. "Mich." The physician's cottage appeared after a ride that felt like years compressed into hours. Dorian hammered on door until elderly man emerged with expression mixing irritation and recognition that transformed into professional focus moment. He saw Seraphina's condition. Inside. Quickly. He cleared table with efficiency that came from decades treating injuries in circumstances that required discretion. "Lay her here. Someone boil water. I need light. More light. Move." They worked through night with precision that left no room for emotion. The physician, Dr. Westwood, though Caedric suspected that wasn't his real name, extracted bullet, cleaned wound, stitched with careful precision, while Seraphina bit leather strap and endured with fortitude that made Caedric's chest ache watching her. Eleanor sat in corner being treated by Westwood's assistant, an older woman who worked without speaking, cleaning wounds and applying poultices with practiced hands. And Caedric stood against wall, feeling useless in ways that violated every instinct toward action. He couldn't calculate solution to bullet wound, couldn't threaten injury into healing, couldn't control outcome through force of will, could only wait while other people worked to save woman he'd nearly gotten killed through strategic calculation that put her in firing line. The realization that partnership sometimes meant accepting helplessness was devastating for a man who'd spent lifetime avoiding vulnerability through absolute control. Dorian stood beside him, equally useless, watching with expression that suggested he was processing similar thoughts about limits of violence as solution. "You did well back there," Dorian said quietly. "With Marcus." Walking away from kill shot when taking it would have been justified. Justified doesn't make it right. Caedric kept his eyes on Seraphina's unconscious form. "I've spent lifetime justifying actions that were strategically sound but ethically bankrupt. Tonight was first time I chose ethics over strategy when stakes were lethal. No idea if that was growth or just different flavor of self-destruction. It was growth. Trust someone who's watched you longer than anyone except your mother. What you did tonight, letting Marcus go, prioritizing Seraphina over tactical advantage, accepting vulnerability instead of imposing control, that's not performance. That's fundamental shift in how you process decisions. Feels like weakness. That's because you've spent lifetime equating vulnerability with failure." Dorian crossed his arms. "But strength isn't refusing to break. It's breaking and choosing to rebuild better. You've broken, Your Grace, multiple times over past 3 months, and every time you've chosen reconstruction that contradicts your father's blueprint. That's not weakness. That's revolution. Revolution feels remarkably like dying slowly, while people you care about bleed on tables and enemies organize pursuit. Welcome to being human." Dorian's smile held no humor. "It's miserable, terrifying, and infinitely more worthwhile than being perfect machine who never risks caring." They fell silent while Westwood worked, night stretching toward dawn through windows that showed landscapes slowly illuminating under sun that rose regardless of human drama playing out in cottage that smelled of blood and antiseptic. Finally, Westwood straightened, wiping hands on cloth. "She'll live. Wound was clean. No major arteries hit. She's strong, young, healthy. Barring infection, which I'll monitor, she'll recover fully within 6 weeks." Relief hit Caedric with force that buckled his knees slightly. He caught himself against wall, breathing like he'd sprinted miles, feeling emotion he'd been suppressing flood through defenses he'd maintained through crisis. "Thank you," he managed. "Don't thank me yet." Westwood studied him with expression mixing professional detachment and something sharper. "She needs rest. No travel for minimum 3 days, no stress, no excitement. And you need to tell me why Duke Ashborne is bringing me gunshot victims at midnight, while looking like man who's been through active war zone. It's complicated. Life usually is." The physician moved to wash his hands. "But understand this clearly. I'm harboring fugitives based on debt to Dorian and professional ethics that say I treat injured regardless of politics. That protection extends 3 days. After that, you need different shelter because my neutrality has limits, and those limits end where pursuit brings violence to my door." "Understood." Caedric moved to Seraphina's side, taking her hand carefully. 3 days. Then we disappear." "Disappear where?" Eleanor spoke from corner where assistant had finished treatment. "Every safe house you controlled is compromised. Every ally is suspect. Parliamentary investigation makes you toxic. And coalition huntingness has resources to search systematically. You can't run forever when they have time and motivation." "Then we don't run." Caedric kept his eyes on Seraphina's unconscious face, memorizing details like man storing images against future absence. "We surrender. On our terms. At location of our choosing. But surrender nonetheless." "That's suicide," Dorian said flatly. "Pembroke's coalition will ensure trial is execution with judicial window dressing." "Maybe." Caedric's voice stayed level. "But continuing to run requires resources we don't have and endangers anyone who shelters us. Fighting requires army we can't assemble and would get hundreds killed. So we choose third option. We surrender publicly, demand trial, and force them to prosecute in daylight under parliamentary observation. Make it legitimate legal proceeding instead of vendetta. They'll still convict you, Eleanor said quietly. Evidence exists. Documentation is real. Your father's crimes are provable, and you've admitted complicity publicly. Yes, they will. He finally looked up. But conviction through proper trial is different than execution in factory. One legitimizes reformation by acknowledging guilt and accepting consequence. Other just makes me martyr for cause I don't actually believe in. I'd rather live or die honestly than preserve life through continued deception. The words would have been incomprehensible 6 months ago when survival was only metric that mattered, and methods were whatever produced optimal outcome. But sitting in cottage watching sunrise while woman he loved recovered from bullet wound acquired because she'd partnered with him, Caedric understood that survival without integrity wasn't actually survival. It was just extended dying while pretending you were alive. Better to face consequence and know you'd stopped running from accountability. Better to accept punishment and demonstrate reformation was genuine, even if demonstration required sacrifice. Better to die honestly than live as ghost of man you'd been pretending to outgrow. That wasn't weakness. That was first actual strength he'd ever displayed. The strength to stop being strong in ways that required constant violence to maintain. They stayed 3 days, as Westwood insisted, time marked by Seraphina's gradual return to consciousness and Eleanor's surprising vitality despite captivity and violence. The cottage existed outside normal time, suspended moment where pursuit hadn't yet caught them and future hadn't yet arrived. Caedric spent hours sitting beside Seraphina's bed, watching her sleep, occasionally reading aloud from books Westwood provided because silence felt heavier than words. He read philosophy mostly, Locke's treatises on government that had started their debates, Mill's essays on liberty, Kant's examinations of moral law. The same works he'd annotated with rationalizations for power now read differently through lens of collapse and reformation. What had seemed like intellectual justification for control now revealed itself as warning about how easily philosophy becomes excuse for exactly what it claims to critique. On second day, Seraphina woke fully and coherent. Her eyes found his immediately with expression, mixing relief and question that he answered by squeezing her hand gently. "We made it," he said quietly. "You're safe. Healing. We have time." "How much time?" "Enough." He helped her sit up carefully. "Westwood says you'll recover fully. No permanent damage beyond scar and story. What happens after recovery?" "We surrender. Turn ourselves in. Face trial for whatever charges they bring." He said it calmly, watching her process implications. "It's only move that doesn't require running forever or fighting war we can't win." She studied his face for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Completely. Surrender is only option that demonstrates reformation isn't tactical, that we're accepting consequence rather than evading it, that whatever I've become over past 3 months is genuine enough to face legal accountability." "That's insane." Her voice carried strength despite weakness. "They'll convict you, probably execute you. You're choosing death over survival. I'm choosing integrity over existence." He brushed hair from her face with tenderness that still felt foreign despite months of practice. "And if that means execution, at least I die as person. I'm trying to become, rather than monster I was. That's better ending than running until age or enemies catch up anyway." Seraphina looked at him with expression he couldn't fully read. "You've changed. Not just surface performance, something fundamental. 3 months of losing everything tends to shift perspective." He smiled without humor. "Turns out empire built on brutality isn't actually worth defending once you see the brutality clearly. And woman who forces you to see clearly changes you in ways that can't be reversed, even when reversal would be strategically optimal." "So what now?" "Now we rest, heal, prepare whatever defense we can mount, and we face consequence together." He squeezed her hand. "Partnership means not abandoning you when stakes get lethal. Even if partnership itself is what made stakes lethal, you're blaming yourself for me getting shot. I'm acknowledging causal chain. I brought you into conflict. You got wounded. That's my responsibility, regardless of whether you chose to come. That's guilt dressed as accountability. She shifted slightly, wincing. I made choice. Accepted risk. Got unlucky with bullet trajectory. That's consequence of my decision, not yours. Stop trying to own every outcome. That's control behavior you're supposed to be unlearning. The observation landed because it was accurate. Caedric was reverting to pattern of assuming responsibility for everything as mechanism to maintain illusion of control. That she could still identify his patterns while recovering from gunshot spoke to how deeply she'd learned to read him. You're right, he said finally. I'm regressing. Fear tends to trigger old responses. Then let me help you not regress. She moved her hand to his face. We face this together. We survive together or fall together. But you don't carry everything alone anymore. That's what partnership means when tested. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, letting himself feel vulnerability without trying to rationalize it as tactical weakness to be eliminated. And for the first time in memory, Caedric allowed himself to simply be present without calculating next move, without strategizing optimal outcome, without maintaining defenses against emotions that made him human instead of machine. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was beginning of actual healing rather than just tactical recovery. They left on fourth morning, traveling south toward London with documents westward forged, showing them as merchant family relocating for business. The physician accepted no payment, just extracted promise from Dorian that he'd return favor someday when circumstances made it possible. The road to London stretched through countryside that seemed indifferent to human drama. Fields and villages continuing their cycles regardless of parliamentary investigations or industrial collapse. They rode at moderate pace, 3 days of travel that gave Seraphina time to recover strength and Caedric time to prepare mentally for surrender that would either legitimize reformation or confirm everyone's suspicions. It was performance. Eleanor rode with surprising stamina, occasionally offering observations about landscape or asking questions about their plan, that revealed she was mentally constructing legal defense, even while pretending casual conversation. On third night, camped in woods outside village, whose name they never learned, his mother approached while Seraphina and Dorian slept. You're planning to take responsibility for your father's crimes, she said without preamble. Full confession, maximum accountability. Yes, that's noble and stupid. She sat beside him near fire burning low enough to provide warmth without advertising their position. Your father committed those atrocities. You inherited consequences but not guilt. There's legal distinction. Legal distinction doesn't matter. Caedric watched flames dance, eye-perpetuated system, maintained control, benefited from foundation built on bodies. That makes me complicit regardless of whether I personally gave orders that killed people. And complicity requires acknowledgement. Your father would never have accepted such accountability. I know. That's why I need to. He looked at her directly. I've spent 3 months trying to become a different person than he was. Better person. But better doesn't mean anything if I only display it when convenient. It means accepting consequence even when acceptance costs everything. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I'm proud of you, she said finally. Terrified for your future. Uncertain whether reformation will survive trial, but proud that you're trying to be man your father could never become. The words hit harder than expected, because approval from woman who'd helped build empire, he was now dismantling carried weight of validation he hadn't realized he needed. Did you know? He asked quietly. About the workers, about the safety violations, about Whitmore's son. Yes? Her voice carried no defensiveness. I knew. Approved some decisions, advised others. I'm as complicit as you are. More, perhaps. Because I was adult when choices were made rather than child inheriting consequences. Then why didn't you stop him? Because I believed empire was worth the cost. That accumulation justified methodology. That we were building legacy that would last generations. She stared into fire. I was wrong. Legacy built on bodies doesn't last. It collapses the moment someone examines foundation clearly. And I helped build something that poisoned my son's soul in service of wealth that proved meaningless the moment it was tested. Are you surrendering too? If it would help your case, yes. But my surrender would be seen as elderly woman seeking sympathy. Yours as man accepting responsibility at peak of capability. More powerful demonstration. So no, I'll testify as witness. Provide documentation. Corroborate your confession. but the weight should fall on you because you're strong enough to carry it. The fire crackled between them while night sounds filled silence. I'm scared, Caedric admitted. First time he'd said words aloud, terrified of trial, execution, failure, of discovering that reformation was just performance convincing enough I believed my own act. That's human. Eleanor touched his shoulder. Your father was never scared because he never questioned himself. You're scared because you do question. That difference is everything. And whatever happens in London, conviction or acquittal, execution or exile, you'll face it as person rather than monster. That's victory regardless of verdict. They sat together while fire burned down, and Caedric processed that perhaps courage wasn't absence of fear, but choosing action despite terror that paralyzed. That facing trial knowing conviction was likely took more strength than avoiding accountability through strategic evasion. That dying honestly was harder than living dishonestly, but left something worth remembering beyond just existence. Quote, they reached London on 6th day, entering through southern gates with papers that passed inspection despite scrutiny. The city had changed in months since Caedric's departure, felt more vibrant somehow, less oppressed by industrial dominance that had characterized Ashborne control. They secured lodging at modest inn using false names and remaining funds. Then Caedric drafted formal letter to Parliament requesting trial, admitting complicity in industrial crimes, and offering full cooperation with investigation in exchange for legal proceeding rather than extrajudicial execution. He sent it via courier to Speaker of Commons, then waited. 3 days later, response arrived. Parliament granted request with conditions. Trial would be public. Documentation would be examined in full parliamentary session. Witnesses would include victims of Ashborne practices. Verdict would be binding without appeal. And Caedric would surrender immediately to custody pending trial rather than remaining free until proceedings began. He accepted all conditions. The morning he turned himself in, Seraphina insisted on accompanying him to courthouse where custody would begin. They walked through London streets that watched with curiosity and hostility mixed, word having spread that Duke Ashborne was voluntarily surrendering for trial. At courthouse steps, she stopped him with hand on his arm. Whatever happens, she said quietly, you've already won. You've become person capable of facing consequence. That's more remarkable than anything your father accomplished through decades of control. I don't feel like I've won anything. Caedric looked at building ahead that represented judgment he'd spent lifetime avoiding. Feel like I'm walking into execution while pretending it's transformation. Maybe they're the same thing. She squeezed his arm. Death of person you were. Birth of person you're becoming. Transformation always feels like dying to parts that can't survive change. He kissed her then, public display that would have horrified him 6 months ago, not caring who witnessed or what it communicated beyond simple truth that she mattered more than appearance. When they separated, she smiled despite tears. Go prove them wrong about you. Prove Marcus wrong. Prove everyone wrong who thinks reformation was performance. And if you can't, if verdict is death, know that you died better man than you lived as. He left her standing on courthouse steps and walked into custody that felt simultaneously like surrender and liberation, giving up control that had never been sustainable and accepting accountability he'd spent lifetime avoiding. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Parliamentary chamber filled daily with observers who watched prosecution present documentation of Ashborne crimes spanning 4 decades. Witness after witness testified about factory deaths, coerced contracts, systematic brutality disguised as business practice. Caedric didn't contest facts, didn't deflect blame, didn't employ legal technicalities that might have reduced charges. He simply acknowledged truth and accepted responsibility. His defense consisted of single argument. That man who commits crimes while believing them justified is dangerous, but man who recognizes crimes and accepts consequence is capable of reformation. That punishing possibility of change prevents anyone from attempting it. That justice should balance accountability with acknowledgement that humans evolve. It was honest defense that offered no excuses, and Parliament didn't know how to process honesty from man they'd expected to fight every charge. Verdict came on 21st day. Guilty on 17 counts of criminal negligence, industrial endangerment, coerced contracts, and conspiracy to conceal corporate crimes. Sentencing would follow deliberation about appropriate consequence that balanced accountability with unprecedented cooperation. Caedric stood as verdict was read, feeling weight of judgment settle over him like physical presence. Not crushing, just present, Acknowledgement that choices had consequences and he'd finally stopped running from them. Seraphina sat in gallery watching with expression that mixed grief and something else he recognized after a moment as respect. Not for verdict, but for how he'd faced it. Sentencing hearing occurred 3 days later. Prosecution demanded execution for crimes resulting in multiple deaths and economic damage spanning years. Defense, attorney Caedric barely knew who'd agreed to represent him, argued for exile and permanent ban from industrial commerce. Parliament deliberated for 6 hours, then rendered judgment that surprised everyone, including Caedric himself. 15 years imprisonment with possibility of parole after 7 pending demonstrated rehabilitation. During incarceration, all remaining Ashborne assets would be liquidated and distributed to victims' families identified through investigation. Caedric would be stripped of title permanently, and upon release, he would be barred from any commercial activity in England for life. It was mercy he hadn't expected, and punishment harsh enough to be legitimate. Standing as sentence was read, Caedric felt something in his chest that might have been relief or devastation, or both existing simultaneously. 15 years, half his life again. Time that would take him from 28 to 43. Years he'd never recover, but also chance to survive. To prove reformation was genuine through behavior rather than words. To potentially live beyond punishment and discover who he could become without empire or control or mechanisms he'd relied on since childhood. Chance was more than his father ever granted anyone he'd destroyed. More than Caedric had granted himself before forced confrontation with consequences. It was mercy he'd spent lifetime refusing to extend. Receiving it felt like cosmic lesson about how power actually worked. That true strength wasn't capacity to impose will, but capacity to accept judgment without resistance. That control achieved through force was always temporary, but integrity maintained through accountability could last lifetime. That man who'd controlled northern England through fear and strategy was less powerful than man who stood in Parliamentary chamber accepting 15 years imprisonment because it was consequence he'd earned. They allowed him 1 hour before custody began in earnest. Escorted meeting in courthouse chamber where Seraphina waited with Eleanor and Dorian. His mother hugged him wordlessly, and when she stepped back, her eyes were wet. 15 years, she said quietly. That's lifetime. You'll be a different person when released. That's the goal. Caedric managed small smile. Become someone worth becoming instead of continuing to be person I've been. I'll maintain what remains of estate. Ensure you have resources when released. Advocate for early parole when possible. Don't. He touched her hand. Let it all go. Distribute assets as sentence mandates. When I'm released, I want to build something from nothing rather than inheriting anything. That's the only way to know whether I've actually changed versus just adapting tactics. That's remarkably principled for a man facing 15 years in prison. Prison gives me time to discover whether principles are genuine or just sophisticated performance. He squeezed her hand once more. Thank you for believing possibility was worth granting chance. Eleanor left with Dorian, who clasped Caedric's shoulder wordlessly before departing, leaving him alone with Seraphina for final minutes before guards returned. She stood by window overlooking London streets, not speaking, and Caedric moved to stand beside her absorbing presence, like man, memorizing landscape before deployment. I won't ask you to wait, he said quietly. 15 years is too long. You should build life without anchoring it to man in prison who might not survive long enough to demonstrate reformation was real. You don't get to decide that. She turned to face him. I'll wait if I choose to wait. Visit if I choose to visit. Move on if I choose to move on. But the choice is mine, not yours. You don't protect me by making decisions about my life. The observation was sharp and accurate and exactly what he needed to hear. You're right, he said. I'm reverting to control patterns again. You're scared. She touched his face. That's human. But scared doesn't mean you revert to protection through isolation. It means you trust that people who care about you will choose their own relationship to your incarceration. I don't deserve that trust. Probably not. Small smile. But I'm giving it anyway because that's what partnership means. You don't earn it through perfect behavior. You build it through mutual choice to remain connected despite circumstances that make connection difficult. 15 years is beyond difficult. Then we'll see how strong partnership actually is when tested across time and distance. Her hand moved to his chest. I'm not promising I'll wait entire 15 years unchanged. I'm promising I won't abandon you just because you're incarcerated. That feels like meaningful distinction. It is. He covered her hand with his. More meaningful than anything I've received in lifetime of demanding loyalty. Then take it into prison with you. Let it remind you that you're not alone even when alone, that reformation has witnesses beyond yourself, that becoming a better person matters to people beyond yourself. She kissed him once more, gentle but carrying weight of promise that transcended vocabulary. When guards returned to escort him to transport, Caedric walked away from freedom and woman he loved and life he'd known toward punishment he'd earned in future he couldn't predict. But he walked upright, without resistance, accepting consequence without rationalization for first time in memory. And if that wasn't redemption, it was at least honest step toward possibility of redemption, which was beginning he'd never allowed himself before. The prison transport rolled through London streets while sun set over city that would continue without his influence or control or presence. 15 years stretched ahead like territory unmapped by anything except commitment to become person worth releasing. He'd been Duke, been monster, been calculating machine optimized for control. Now he'd learn whether he could be human, whether reformation survived when tested across years rather than months, whether man who'd controlled everything could survive having nothing except commitment to change. The outcome wasn't certain, but certainty had never been actual strength anyway. Just illusion that prevented growth through comfort of never being tested. Discomfort was where transformation lived. Prison would provide discomfort in abundance. And Caedric discovered that facing 15 years of consequence with integrity felt more powerful than any empire he'd controlled through fear. Not because it was easy, because it was true. And truth, it turned out, was only foundation strong enough to build life upon when everything else collapsed. The obsidian Duke was gone. What remained was man named Caedric, learning to be human in ways that required giving up every defense mechanism that had made him dangerous. That was a terrifying journey, but also the only one worth surviving. Samtits. Years later, when prison sentence had been survived and parole granted and life rebuilt from nothing, Caedric would stand with Seraphina in modest house they'd built together through labor rather than inheritance, watching sun rise over landscape that belonged to no one, and he would finally understand what his father never learned. That power measured in control was always temporary, but power measured in capacity to change, to grow, to become better than you were, that was permanent. That surviving loss of everything revealed what mattered beyond empire and wealth and dominance. That person who stayed when you had nothing was infinitely more valuable than thousands who knelt when you had everything. That becoming human after a lifetime of being weapon was hardest thing he'd ever accomplished, and only thing actually worth accomplishing. The Ashborne name ended with his incarceration, but the person he'd become outlasted any legacy his father built. And that was victory no trial could take away. No verdict could diminish, no empire could match. Just man and woman who'd learned that partnership survived when nothing else did. That reformation was possible even for monsters. That accountability was beginning rather than ending, and that sometimes losing everything was only way to discover what you actually needed. The sun continued rising, life continued moving, and Caedric Ashborne, no longer Duke, no longer obsidian, just human learning to be human, discovered that was enough. More than enough. Everything.